Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me today. We will touch upon Taiwan's key roles in democracy, strategic position, and economic strength that every country has a stake. Impact on not only Taiwan, the East Asia, the US, but the whole world. Taiwan is the only full-fledged democracy in Chinese-speaking world. After China's separation of Hong Kong, Taiwan stands out at the front line, defending our shared values. Taiwan also holds the strategic position in geopolitics. If Taiwan were endangered by China, China would gain the gateway to the Indo-Pacific region, making Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea its domestic waters. In addition, Taiwan's control over Taiwan's high-tech companies, such as TSMC, would fiercely impact global security and modern life. Taiwan produces about 90% of sophisticated chips, especially extremely critical to high-tech weaponry, AI industry, auto cars, and more. If one thinks the consequences of losing Taiwan seem remote, think about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It is an alarming yet ongoing example. The entire world is still undertaking the reverberation. Food and energy prices sharply increased, resulting in high inflation and slower growth. So I hate to say this, but a Taiwan war will be more catastrophic. Last week, we saw China conducted military exercises, set up a non-fly zone around Taiwan again, and sent record fighter jets crossing the median line of Taiwan Straits, in just a retaliation of our president's usual transit and meetings with US senior officials. So how can we prevent a war? The answer is quite simple. There's nothing beyond our capability as long as we stand together. Whenever China crosses the line, we need to respond equivocally. So public condemnation should be applied to its military exercises and violation of human rights. Freedom of navigation operations should be continuously conducted by parties of interest. Sufficient defense deterrence need to be maintained to make our enemies think twice. The principle of universality should be upheld to advance the global citizens' welfare. More fair and free trade engagement should be also facilitated. Most importantly, we shouldn't be told by China about what we can or can't do, as we are the free world. So I would like to give a special thanks to Georgia Tech Nunn School for our first-time cooperation. This seminar happens to take place at the time China flexes its muscles again, becoming more aggressive and difficult to manage. So I look forward as much as our audience to the insightful discussion from the distinguished speaker and the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Director General Wang. And the symposium is also not possible without the support from the Nunn School, especially from its chair, Dr. Adam Stolberg. And Adam's vision has always been about building connections using synergy and showcase the impacts of research. So when he knew of these symposium, he simply supported it full-heartedly. So please join me in welcome Dr. Stolberg for his opening remarks.
Well, let me just say on behalf of the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs here at Georgia Tech, I just would like to extend a heartfelt thanks to TECO, in particular to the Director General, and to our own Dr. Lin for really putting together a very substantively rich agenda that I think is especially timely. It's from at least our perspective for at least two reasons. One, of course, has to do with the nature of the international environment that we find ourselves in today. As was mentioned, we see Russia's war of choice in Ukraine, together with the mounting tensions in the Indo-Pacific, as well as the unfolding of the global supply chain and digital revolutions that are simultaneously underscoring pressures of techno-nationalism and techno-globalism that are fundamentally changing the international landscape. And I think the topics of today, given the rise of China and the role of Taiwan in the global supply chain and political economy, are front and center of international relations today. So kudos to Dalton and the team for putting together such a timely set of panels. The second reason has to do with the Sam Nunn School. This couldn't be a better opportunity to really showcase some of the research and talent that we have in-house and with friends at other local universities. But with respect to the school, we have not been sitting on our hands over the last 3 years during COVID lockdown, but rather have introduced a series of new programming, such as one that features commercial diplomacy and economic statecraft. Another one featuring an online master's in international security, a burgeoning partnership with a brand new interdisciplinary school in cybersecurity and privacy, where we have a joint appointment. You'll hear from one of our faculty members in that regard. A range and a great stable of distinguished professors of the practice. All of these programs, including a new program in Washington, D.C., that the Sam Nunn School and the School of Public Policy will be jointly running on behalf of Georgia Tech. All of these programs are really aimed at trying to address some of these contemporary practical processes that are really marking today's international environment, both on the security front and on the economic front, and especially where they intersect. So again, I want to thank our co-sponsor TECO and the Director General and Dr. Lin for really putting together a full program, and thank you all again for showing up.
So thank you, Adam. In addition to TECO and Sam Nunn School, the symposium is also generously sponsored by the General Ray Davis Endowment Fund, the Center for International Strategy, Technology and Policy, and the Program on Emerging Technology and International Security at the Nunn School. And so my colleague, Chris McDermott, who is also key to make this symposium possible, worried that the title of this symposium is really too academic, and that's what I do, and not exciting enough. So I assume full responsibility for that. But hopefully you will find the discussions and the content exciting and enlightening. So by the way, before we start, I just want to remind you that please feel free to stand up and grab refreshments and coffee whenever you need them, because TECO and Sam Nunn School make sure to provide you with lots of food for thoughts and food for fact. So we hope you get the best of the two worlds. So now, without further ado, let's proceed with our first section, the keynote speech by Dr. Shelley Rieger. So when TECO and I planned for the symposium, my colleague Dr. Alistair Young reminded me that despite Taiwan has been more frequently in the news, Taiwan is still not a subject that most of our audience will be familiar with. So we need a keynote speech to provide the crucial background knowledge. And I completely agree. And for that purpose, the first name come to my mind is Dr. Shelley Rieger. And I'm really honored that she accepted our invitation to give keynote speech. Dr. Rieger is the Brown Professor of Asian Studies and Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of Faculty at Davidson College. She is a graduate of Harvard and Princeton, and her research interests are Taiwanese politics and U.S.-China-Taiwan relations. She was a Fulbright Scholar at National Taiwan University in Taipei and has held numerous visiting professor and researcher positions at universities in both Taiwan and China. So that enabled her to have firsthand observation of the delicate relations between the two sides. And that's also what makes her an expert frequently consulted by the US government, especially on Taiwan policy issues. And her book, Why Taiwan Matters, is the must read for anyone who wants to know Taiwan better. So let me just end my introduction by telling you this. Dr. Rieger understands Taiwan better than the Taiwanese. I'm from Taiwan, so you should trust me when I say that. And then Dr. Rieger will verify that for you. Okay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rieger.
Thank you, Dalton. I actually do not understand Taiwan better than Taiwanese. Obviously, that would be absolutely impossible. But I have devoted a fair amount of time over the years to trying to understand a little more about Taiwan and how it fits into the world and why it is important to us in the United States, to others around the world, and also to people in and from Taiwan themselves. So why Taiwan matters can be, it's a kind of statement, you know, I'm going to tell you why Taiwan matters, but it obviously originates with a question: why does Taiwan matter? So I'm just going to spend a few minutes today laying out some of the reasons maybe why Taiwan matters, and I hope I'll be able to do that fast enough to leave some time for questions. But first, I want to thank the TECO office here in Atlanta, especially Director General Wang, for sponsoring and hosting this wonderful event, which I notice is very well attended, including by people who I have reason to believe are probably students here at Georgia Tech. So good on you for coming out on Monday for an academic event. That is really fantastic. And thanks also to the Sam Nunn School and to my good friend Dalton for bringing us all together today. So why does Taiwan matter? People have been asking this question for decades, and they are still asking it now. And I think actually now more than in some recent years. So there's lots of attention on Taiwan at the moment. And so it's important for us to continue to reflect on why Taiwan matters, why it's important, why we should care. And one reason that we need to keep thinking about it is the answer keeps changing, right? Why Taiwan matters is not the same today as it was in 1950 or 1960 or 1970. One question I get a lot before I start talking about why Taiwan matters, maybe to me or to us, one question I hear often is, why does Taiwan matter to the People's Republic of China? Often phrased this way: why do they care so much? Why don't they just get over it? We can talk about that more in the Q&A, and I'm sure that other speakers over the course of the day will speak to that question. I would just offer very quickly 3 reasons why Taiwan matters to the PRC. One is a kind of historical legacy, both of China's civil war and perhaps more importantly of US playing a strong role in the Asia-Pacific, which has been a source of frustration to PRC leaders over time. Another is PRC domestic politics. Taiwan matters in the way that PRC leaders, Communist Party leaders, justify their own authority within China. And Taiwan matters because of its geostrategic location. Director General Wang mentioned this. A good friend of mine and one of the other speakers today, Jacques Delisle, Alan Wachman, wrote a whole book on the geostrategic importance of Taiwan for China, including for the ROC and for the PRC. But we're here to talk about why Taiwan matters. And I think what we're really here to talk about is why Taiwan matters to the United States. Generally, when there's a meeting in the US, that's the question of the day. So I think there are two sets of reasons that are often offered for why Taiwan matters to the US. One set of reasons, which are the predominant ones, are utilitarian and self-interested. What is Taiwan's importance to US interests? But I think there are also matters of principle at stake in US-Taiwan relations that are worth mentioning. In many situations and over much of the post-war historical era, self-interest and principles seemed to align for the US with respect to Taiwan, so that we didn't have to sort of differentiate matters of principle from matters of self-interest. But they have not always aligned. And I think increasingly in this moment, they are not entirely well aligned. And American policymakers are in danger of placing US self-interest ahead of some critical principles, including the principle of prioritizing the well-being of Taiwanese people ahead of even some US interests, that we cannot claim to be working on behalf of the Taiwanese people when we are acting against perhaps the preferences or interests of the Taiwanese people themselves in order to achieve some goal of our own. So Americans need to keep Taiwan's own interests in view when we are considering this issue, and not just tell ourselves that whatever serves our interests automatically serves Taiwan as well. So let me just mention briefly why Taiwan matters to the US has evolved over time. In the 1950s and 60s, and no, I promise that this is not going to go on for the next 45 minutes, even though I'm starting in the 1950s. In the 1950s and 60s, so the high era of the Cold War, Taiwan mattered to the US because it was a bulwark against communist expansion in Northeast Asia. It was a cork in a bottle, trapping the Reds on the Chinese mainland and preventing communism from bursting through further into the Pacific toward Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and beyond. Taiwan was also an economic and security partner of the US in the 50s and especially into the 1960s on the economic side. And these motivations were enough to inspire US officials to overlook the reality of Taiwan's domestic political situation, which was that it was an authoritarian single-party state, not really a democracy, even though the US lingo at the time was that it was free China. In the 1970s, many people in the US began to ask the question, does Taiwan matter to the US now that the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China are no longer as close as lips and teeth, but in fact are experiencing a significant amount of tension and even conflict. And this is creating for the US the opportunity to slide in between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. So a lot of people saw the Sino-Soviet split as an opportunity for the US to turn away from Taiwan and to normalize relations with the People's Republic of China, the PRC. And this is a story we spend a lot of time on here in Atlanta because President Carter was the one who finalized a process of normalization with the PRC, but that process began in the early 1970s under President Nixon. So Taiwan's why Taiwan mattered or whether Taiwan mattered to the US was somewhat in question in the 1970s. But in the 1980s and 90s, Taiwan reinvented itself as a democracy. And that really changed the calculus for Americans. It was no longer possible to sort of say Taiwan doesn't matter because Taiwan was no longer an anti-communist bulwark, admittedly, but now it was part of the community of democratic nations and an even more important economic partner to the United States. And after 1989, after the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, and US relations with the People's Republic of China became more complicated, Taiwan re-emerged as a place that mattered in US foreign policy. And it went from bulwark against communism to beacon of democracy in the kind of lingo of US foreign policy. Just a few years after derecognition, so after 1979, the US began characterizing Taiwan more and more as an important partner of the US in terms of American values and also in terms of American alliances and alliance credibility. So it's really in the 90s that we start to hear lots of discussion of Taiwan as an important bellwether for American reliability and credibility in terms of alliance commitments to South Korea, to Japan, to the Philippines most immediately, but also to other partners and allies around the world. In the early 1990s, Taiwan's importance as an economic partner seemed to be potentially fading. Many of the people in this room, or some of the people in this room, can remember sitting through conferences. Maybe there was even one here at Georgia Tech. I definitely at University of South Carolina. I feel like we had one at Georgia Tech sometime in the early 90s, where we were all asking, oh my gosh, is Taiwan's economy hollowing out? Because so much of Taiwan's traditional manufacturing had moved to mainland China after 1987, that it seemed as if Taiwan's economy might never recover from the loss of manufacturing. Of course, what we know now is that we were completely wrong, and that Taiwan's economy re-emerged even more strongly than ever in the 1990s on the strength of the high-tech revolution that was driven both by private capital and innovation in Taiwan, and also by very wise and aggressive government policy to promote industrial rebuilding on this high-tech model. So no one questions whether Taiwan matters economically in 2023, even though in 1993, we worried about it a lot. So when I wrote the book, Why Taiwan Matters, in the early 2000s, the reasons that I put in the chapter on why Taiwan actually matters were the democratic beacon thing, the allies and US credibility thing, the indicator of what China, what the PRC would be, what kind of global power the PRC was likely to be, and the test of US commitment to its own values thing. These were the reasons I gave for why Taiwan was mattering in around 2010. Since then, however, and especially with growing intensity since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, a new angle has emerged or re-emerged in how Americans think about why Taiwan matters to us. Taiwan is back as a cork in a bottle. No longer a bulwark against communist expansion, but as a bulwark against a Chinese state, a PRC state that is seeking, well, we don't really know. There's lots of discussion about what the PRC is seeking, but depending on who you ask, lots of things potentially. And so there is this rising discourse in US foreign policy circles about the need to block China's rise, or to block China's expansion, or to prevent the PRC from taking its position or taking a position as a leading global nation. So you hear people in foreign policy circles, I don't necessarily hear this so much from officials, but certainly from people who want to be officials and from people who want to advise officials. We hear things like lots of people talking about the first island chain, people talking about sanctioning Taiwan, the US government putting sanctions on Taiwan for not doing its own defense the way people in the US think they should do it. And I have heard with these very ears on my head, people talking about the necessity for the US to use its own weapons against strategic economic sites in Taiwan in order to prevent them from falling into the wrong hands. And you know, like that's when the record scratch sound needs to happen in the speech. You know there is something wrong when there are people in the United States advocating using military force against Taiwan to protect Taiwan from something. So that's why I think the self-interested motive of preventing the PRC from developing in a certain way has diverged from, and in some ways crowded out, the principles that we also need to keep in mind when we're thinking about foreign policy. For some Americans, Taiwan has become a kind of pawn or a tool or a weapon. In other words, an object. And most of us in this room are familiar enough with Taiwan to know that a central feature of Taiwan's battle for freedom over the last 70 years has been precisely its fight to be a subject and not an object, right? In Chinese, we talk about 主体性, in English, subjectivity. This is the goal of the Taiwanese people, is to come out of its position as the Cold War object of other countries' interests, and including the Chiang Kai-shek regime, making Taiwan a subject in a particular version, a Chinese nationalist version of history. Taiwan has fought so long to come out of this position of subjectivity, to be the central player in its own story, to come out of the position of an object, to be the subject of its own story. So when people ask me today why Taiwan matters, the answer has to have Taiwan, its own people, its own interests, its own security as the Taiwanese understand it, and above all, its own democracy at the center of the answer. Taiwan does not matter to me because it is an instrument of US foreign policy, much less because it's a tool that we can use in US domestic politics, which is also something that I see happening. Seeing Taiwan in that way is to abandon our values and reduce Taiwan and its people to pawns in a battle that is not about Taiwan at all, but is about Americans. So Taiwan matters to America for many reasons: ideological or value-based reasons, strategic reasons, economic reasons, but it matters to Taiwan as a homeland. And so those of us who claim to support and to work for Taiwan need to never forget that. We need to work with our Taiwanese friends and partners to deter and prevent, as Director General Wang said, the worst case scenario, not to make use of Taiwan to pursue our own goals with regard to China. So with that, I will stop filibustering from the podium and invite your questions.
Oh, Bailey. Oh, they can't hear you online. All right. Failing One Seminar School. Welcome back, Shirley. You were right. Actually, we had a meeting here, conference here on Taiwan years ago, and you were attending. I still remember that. Very great speech, and I agree with you wholeheartedly that we should not treat Taiwan simply as an instrument, as a tool, but rather treat Taiwan as a subject of its own, right? But my question is, of course, I guess you probably prepared for this. Is how? Given what we have here in the United States, there are going to be people in the United States who will treat Taiwan as a, well, if you call it a soldier, a pawn, a comrade in fighting against the possible PRC ambitions, right? And how do you sort of navigate that kind of different opinions in the United States to sort of help Taiwan, but without subjugating Taiwan too much? How to move forward, how to combine all these forces and to eventually satisfy the main goal, that is to safeguard Taiwan, right? I actually would submit, would consider, maybe we should not just dismiss that instrumentalist approach too easily. Maybe we should try to take advantage of that, incorporate that into the overall discourse, right? Yes, there are going to be people treat Taiwan as an instrument, as a pawn, fine. It's like when I went to Israel, I heard many American evangelicals were donating heavily to the Jewish settlement on West Bank, right? And I asked my Jewish friends, say, do you know why they donate money for you? Because they want to accelerate the second coming of Jesus Christ. And that is supposed to be kind of an end for you, for the state of Israel as a whole. But my Jewish friends were really wise, and they said, we don't care. As long as it's free money, we'll take it, and to defend our own nation. So what I'm trying to say here, maybe we could incorporate different views, but somehow move forward. And that's where I want to have your wisdom, how to move forward. Thank you.
Yes. So first of all, the verdict of those who believe that expanding settlements in the Palestinian territories will inevitably succeed, and that in the long run the state of Israel will benefit from that settlement activity. The door is still open on that one. I think they could live to rue the day they ever took that free money, which, the people who are providing that free money are providing it because they know that, or they believe that they are accelerating literally the apocalypse in the violent, explosive conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. So, beware of free money always. As far as Taiwan is concerned, I think it's sort of the same. It's very easy to get very excited and heated about the idea of how the U.S. could suppress. So first, it's easy to become very captivated by the idea of a kind of maximalist view of the PRC's intentions in the world. And to imagine that not only is the PRC seeking to, stabilize the near abroad and make its own neighborhood safer for Beijing's economic and social policies and so on, but to then inflate that to mean they're taking over the whole world, and you can open a magazine any day. Or I guess nobody opens a magazine anymore. That was the dumbest thing I've said all day. But that you can turn on the internet and find someone who claims to know what they're talking about, who will tell you that China's objective, that the PRC's objective, is to control the entire world. So you start with this kind of ever-inflating maximalist view of PRC intentions and ambitions, and then you're very quickly chasing down this road where the US must stop at nothing to prevent this from happening. So if that means we have to throw Taiwan in front of the onrushing PRC military juggernaut, then, oh well, sorry, Taiwan, but that was just what we had to do. So we need to slow down and really understand what are the PRC's objectives, what are the PRC's limitations as well as its strengths, and not just assume that intention and strength are the only things that matter with respect to the PRC's future. And then we also need to ask, how do people in Taiwan understand their situation? So I don't know if I had $1 for every person who's asked me, why are Taiwanese not as worried about their own security as I am here in America? I wouldn't be rich, but I would be richer. And the answer is, I don't know, but they've been under this sword for 70 years. And they have successfully deterred, prevented, one way or another, avoided the confrontation that Americans have been predicting for them pretty much continuously throughout those 70 years, with a brief little interruption in the early 1990s. So I think leaders in Taiwan actually understand the situation that they are in and have some wisdom for addressing it. And we should be listening and thinking and giving credit to their ideas. Speaking just very concretely, I think the US should focus its attention on actions that have substantive benefit to Taiwan. I am not an opponent of arms sales, for example, because arms sales have substantive benefit to Taiwan. What I don't understand is American politicians grandstanding and speechifying and making Taiwan a side project of their own domestic political combat, and not thinking about what are the consequences for our friend if we drag our friend into something that is actually not their fight. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I have a very specific question for you. So when you mention why Taiwan matters, and also Taiwan being a pawn of the United States. So one thing comes in my mind based on my technology background is TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which accounts for over 50% of the semiconductor manufacturing in the world. So I had a discussion with a senior VP of TSMC in Taiwan in past December. So I kind of understand the position, but what does the United States, academic or political, what do they view TSMC in general? So, I mean, right now, my feeling is United States is still struggling, trying to define what the position is of TSMC for United States. So I want to know what do you think about it, based on what your understanding with the United States political and economical and the academic point of view.
Well, I am not an expert on TSMC, so I'm out on a limb. But it's just a Q&A, so I can't talk too long. I think the U.S. I think TSMC is a good example of exactly the phenomenon that I'm talking about here, which is that on the one hand, many Americans, most Americans say TSMC is a fantastic company. It is adding value to the whole world. It is an incredibly important global asset that cannot be replaced anywhere, right? But wouldn't it be better if it was here in our country instead of there in somebody else's country? So, like we want TSMC to open a fab in Arizona or in Ohio or somewhere. And also, by the way, it's important for TSMC to echo the national security priorities of the United States. So please don't sell chips to Huawei, and please don't open fabs in mainland China, even though maybe that's the only place that is economically viable to open that fab, or maybe that's where your customers are. And honestly, all your customers is making is this to send to here. So, what is the national security implications really of TSMC making chips for my Fitbit in China and then making my Fitbit in China? So we're doing two things at once. The United States has this incredibly unstoppable economic relationship with the People's Republic of China. And yet we sort of want to cherry pick things that we think of as strategic and pull, like a Jenga game. We want to pull these blocks out of the economic relationship, never envisioning what it's going to look like if we pull the wrong block and the whole thing comes tumbling down, right? And one of the things that I think Americans need to be introspective about is, why are we pulling the TSMC block out, and why are we enacting policies in our own country that are aimed at undermining Taiwan's position in the global high-tech supply chain? Because as much as the CHIPS Act was, there's lots of stuff in there to support, and it was kind of talked about in Washington as if it was a pro-Taiwan thing. It's totally not a pro-Taiwan thing. It's totally a industrial policy aimed at making Taiwan's primary export not important anymore. So what exactly do we think we're doing? I don't think we know, and I don't think we've really thought through all of the implications. So I think TSMC is super important. And also, I don't think the CHIPS Act is going to succeed in pulling TSMC out of Taiwan, because the business model of TSMC, I'm 61 years old. I just turned 61. I'm gonna make a prediction, and there are a handful of people in the room who will outlive me. I'm confident. I don't think the US will be capable of manufacturing according to the TSMC model in my lifetime, because we don't have the engineers, but we also don't have the HVAC technicians. In Hsinchu Science Park in Taiwan, there are night crews of HVAC guys who deploy all night long to TSMC semiconductor fabs to make sure that the temperature doesn't go up a degree or down a degree. It has to be perfect all the time. Good luck controlling the temperature to within 1 degree Celsius in Arizona. That's my answer.
Dr. Rieger, thank you. It occurs to me, talking about the need to avoid treating Taiwan as a subject and embrace treating Taiwan as an object, or recognizing Taiwan as an object, that it's sort of, it can become an inevitable trap for us to fall into. Just looking at the subject of the second panel, framing Taiwan as part of the US conflict in China. I mean, it's something I think we can fall into a trap ourselves, as long as we continue to think of Taiwan along those terms. And I wonder if part of the answer to recognizing Taiwan as an object might not be to focus more on what the Taiwanese themselves have accomplished. It occurs to me that Taiwan is the first country in Asia to legalize same-sex marriage as of 2019. They've made the embracing and the defending of human rights a part of their national identity. And if that might not be something, that kind of subject might not be something we could focus on more, and to begin to see Taiwan as an object rather than a subject. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it is really important not to allow a kind of national security driven framing to overwhelm and overtake and overshadow all other ways of understanding what Taiwan is. Because as a matter of fact, you know what, one of the things I thought about doing as part of this talk was defining, when we say, you know, when I ask the question, why does Taiwan matter? What do I mean by Taiwan? And what I mean by Taiwan is the society that exists on the island of Taiwan, also Jinmen, Penghu, Mazu, et cetera. And that is a society that feels to me really constructed on a set of kind of political or social norms that differentiate Taiwan certainly from mainland China, and as Director General Wang said, from all other Chinese-speaking societies that exist today. So what it is, to me, what makes Taiwan Taiwan is a kind of civic nationalism around democratic values. And the democratic values in Taiwan are not entirely, but very strongly inflected by progressive preferences across a range of issues. Economic egalitarianism. Taiwan is a place where it's simultaneously very pro-business, but also very egalitarian. And there's a lot of distrust of rising inequality. I think that's a major source of dissatisfaction with the current government, honestly, is its inability to reverse the rising income inequality and wealth inequality in society. So it's kind of a more egalitarian version, also a highly liberal version in terms of civil rights and things like freedom of speech, your lively, you know, like the TV talk shows drive me crazy, just like they drive everybody in Taiwan crazy, but they are a manifestation of a very liberal idea about social discourse. And then progressivism on a lot of social issues, of which LGBTQ rights have been the flagship, because Taiwan has distinguished itself on that measure. In 2019, when I was doing my Fulbright year at Taida, I went to the Pride Parade, and there were groups of people marching through the streets of Taiwan with flags saying, our country, Japan, Korea, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, our country should follow the lead of Taiwan on this issue. So when I hear people on the left falling into the trap of, well, Taiwan, that's a right-wing thing, that's a Republican thing, that's a conservative thing. I'm listening to the arguments that people in the PRC are making about how they've been colonized by the West and they got to get Taiwan back in order to decolonize their history. Like, we're going to talk about Ukraine later. I mean, it's the same story that Putin tells about Ukraine. It's the same story that Xi Jinping tells about Taiwan. And the same dummies on the left are falling for both of them. And in the process, overlooking the fact that many of their so-called progressive values are well embodied in Taiwan in a way that they absolutely are not in mainland China, in a way that they are in Ukraine and absolutely are not in Russia. So yeah, thank you for that.
So I would thank you again for coming to speak, of course, but one of the most simple gestures you can give to a country is to recognize them. I believe the simplest thing, I mean, no one would question the legitimacy of Japan or Korea or the Philippines or other local states. So if the US is going to make an effort at not looking at Taiwan as a pawn, but as a nation full of people that have opinions and rights and those kind of things, is it required or is it necessary for the United States to recognize Taiwan at least as a legitimate state before we can move forward into interacting with them beyond seeing them as just an object?
You had to ask that question. I was ending on a high note, and now I'm going to have to make a lot of people unhappy. The answer is no, because one thing that we do know for sure is that would be the day or couple days before the war began. And the war is what we have to deter and prevent. War in the Taiwan Strait would make Ukraine look like reasonably not the worst thing that ever happened in the 21st century. Unlike Ukrainians, Taiwanese cannot leave. They won't, there will be no place to go. And the PRC, the People's Liberation Army, we should assume will be every bit as savage and merciless as the Russians are. There's no reason to expect the PLA to give any quarter. They will attack from the air and they will destroy everything they can in order to flatten the country so that they can invade and occupy it. So if we start from that, then we have to start from the principle that, however imperfect it may be, a solution that deters and prevents military conflict is a solution that we have to make room for. So while, yeah, it would have been great if the US could have avoided derecognition of Taiwan back in the 1970s, that was not what happened. And we live in the world we live in now, which is a world in which the PRC, for dumb reasons that other people can tell you about, has determined cannot abide US recognition of the Republic of China or Taiwan, or the Republic of China, comma, Taiwan, or whatever, as a sovereign, as a legally sovereign state in the world. So sorry, but one more, yeah. Somebody get me off the hook.
Cool, nice, okay. So you've talked a lot, and I mean, the entire subject of this speech is why Taiwan matters. But especially as my generation's kind of coming up into the world, and we'll be looking at these things in the future. And this is just going to be a very blunt question. How do we make people care, right? Like, I know there's a lot of things where people can pass off stuff like, you know, generally caring about the Taiwanese people as like, oh, that's just ideology. We have to look at the United States' power and all of this. But like, obviously, you know, we've talked about the fact that Taiwan's subjectivity really matters. And so, yeah, how do we convince people of that, I guess?
That's a great question. And it's really hard, but I would say this, you know, this is the work of those of us who want to persuade people to pay attention and to recognize that Taiwan does matter. The TECO in Atlanta, TECO in Washington, all of the offices that Taiwan's government sponsors around the world spend an inordinate share of their resources on public diplomacy for exactly this reason. One thing that frustrates me, honestly, is how readily media will embrace a story that's about conflict, and how challenging it is sometimes to get stories that are not about conflict, but are about other aspects of Taiwan's situation in the world that are maybe more positive or more that suggest a brighter future rather than this narrowing tunnel of pain. It's hard sometimes to get people to in the media to tell those other stories, which is why I think the marriage equality was such a powerful one for Taiwan, because it did. What are the things that put Taiwan on the front page? TSMC, which is a great story, a great company, incredible technology, same-sex marriage, marriage equality, and the successful parrying of COVID for more than 2 years. And admittedly, you know, Taiwan did eventually get COVID, but compared to the way everybody else got COVID, Taiwan's COVID response was a huge success. Dalton, we're out of time, are we not?
There are a lot of people wanting to ask questions, but we ran out of time. But already a lot of food for thought for me to reflect on myself, hopefully for you as well. So So please join me in thanking Dr. Reader for this. Okay, so we will now directly proceed to our first panel, how to prevent the Taiwan War, lesson from Ukraine and beyond. But again, please feel free to stand up and get whatever you need, even though we don't have a break. So please, the panelists for first panel and the moderator, please come to the table. Thank you, Michelle. Okay, so now let me first introduce our moderator, the Honorable Michelle Flournoy, and then Michelle will introduce the panelists. So Ms. Flournoy is a distinguished professor of the practice at the Nunn School. Of course, for me, I would say that's her most important title. But so she is the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy under President Barack Obama, and the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy under President Bill Clinton. As a distinguished defense policy advisor, she was one of the top candidates for President Biden's choice of Secretary of Defense in 2020. She is the co-founder of the Center for New American Security and the co-founder and current managing partner of West Exact Advisor. Forgive me, even our senators don't know how to pronounce that. Yeah. So and by the way, Secretary of State and Antony Blinken is another co-founder of the West Exact. So we are really honored to have Michelle with us today. So Michelle, the floor is yours. Thank you.
No? Yes? Okay, great. Well, first of all, so glad to be here. Thank you for the warm introduction, and thank you to the Sam Nunn School and to TECO for hosting this very important conversation today. The motivating question for our panel is how to prevent war in Taiwan or over Taiwan. And I want to spend a little bit of time just teeing up the topic. And then I'll introduce our panelists and we'll start the discussion. This is the central question, I believe, first and foremost for the people of Taiwan, as was discussed, but also in terms of managing the strategic competition between the United States and China, which has economic dimensions, technological dimensions, ideological dimensions, and military dimensions. But ultimately, history will judge us by whether we were able to manage this competition, which is a fact of life, but to keep it short of open conflict. And Taiwan is the most immediate potential flashpoint. I would say I'd like to unpack a little bit of the key assumptions that have led people to be more concerned about the potential risk of conflict in the mid to long term. First of all, the Chinese perspective on Taiwan. I think it's fair to say that Xi Jinping is he is both a product of the system, but also a different leader than some of his immediate predecessors. He has consistently talked about Taiwan as a rogue province and talked about the longer term need for reunification, but he's also been clear that he sees this as a legacy issue. And he wants to pursue this as a major priority on his watch. Now, I think it's fair to say that Beijing's preference would be to eventually find a way to bring Taiwan back into the PRC fold using political and economic measures. So for those of you who are Star Trek fans, think absorption into the Borg, shrinking Taiwan's international space, putting huge amount of political pressure on them, economically enveloping them and entangling them, but sort of giving Taiwan no more space and ultimately no choice. But Xi's been very different in that he's also been clear, well, at least, there's lots of information that suggests that he's also instructed his military to ensure that he has an option, a viable option to use force by 2027, if it comes to that. Now, I'm not saying that he will necessarily use that option, but I think this is the first time where the United States has had a very concrete sense, based on the information it's gathered, that we have a Chinese leader who's not thinking about this just in terms of 100-year anniversaries or 2049, but a leader who is thinking about this as something that he will contemplate in the near to midterm. And that is part of what's contributed to a greater sense of concern and urgency in U.S. national security circles. Now, as was mentioned, the U.S. sees Taiwan through many different lenses. First and foremost, as this vibrant democracy that shares our values, a very important economic partner on which we rely. And that's even more true given the predominance of TSMC in the semiconductor sector. But beyond the 50% that figure that was quoted, if you look at TSMC's contribution to advanced chips, the chips that are used in the most cutting edge technology, including US defense and aerospace and others, that figure goes up to over 90%. So this is an absolutely critical technology. Taiwan is a critical technology partner. And I think there's also this concern that if China were allowed to use force to force its will on Taiwan, that would change the rules of the international system in the Indo-Pacific, which is the most important region for our security and our prosperity and that of Americans over the next at least half century, if not beyond. So that, I think, is what is motivating this concern in the U.S. national security community. So if we look at, okay, what are the lessons we should learn from the ongoing conflict in Ukraine? I think the very first thing that strikes me is the importance of preparation. The United States and many other European allies did a lot of work with Ukrainian military and Ukrainian society to build resilience and build capability and a new way of operating after the invasion and illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. So we used that time between 2014 and 2022 to really help the Ukrainian military be qualitatively different in its ability to combat an invading force and defend the society. So importance of preparation. And the obvious question that comes up for the panel is, what does that kind of preparation for Taiwan's resilience defense look like? Might be very different given the different circumstances of Taiwan, but very important lesson. Second key strategic lesson is criticality of allies and partners. There is no NATO in the Indo-Pacific, but I think the kind of cohesion and sense of common purpose that the US and NATO allies were able to achieve in the face of Russia's illegal war against Ukraine is an example of something that, how do we build the cohesion across the international community writ large, but particularly among democracies and like-minded states who care about the rule of law and the international order in the Indo-Pacific? How do we build that kind of unified perspective on the importance of preventing aggression against Taiwan. And lastly, the biggest strategic lesson, I think, it comes back to the importance of deterrence. As was mentioned, Taiwan is an island. It doesn't have the same options as Ukraine. We've seen how high the costs of war, the human tragedy that's been unfolding in Ukraine. We don't want to see that happen in Taiwan. And so in my view, the name of the game is preventing war over Taiwan, first and foremost for the sake of the Taiwanese people, but also because it would involve a direct confrontation between two nuclear armed powers, the United States and China. And I think that would be disastrous for the world. So we're going to spend some time talking about what deterrence requires, whether it's, from how do we communicate our resolve? How do we communicate? The most important question is, how do we affect Xi Jinping's calculus about the costs, both the costs of starting such a conflict, but also create uncertainty in his mind about his chances of succeeding? That's really what deterrence is about. If Xi were to start this war and fail, I'm pretty sure he would lose power, or he'd have certainly risk losing power. So it's a very big, we have to remind the Chinese leadership that this would be a big, big gamble for them. And we need to demonstrate with both capabilities and diplomacy that we have to create doubt in their mind that they can succeed. And every day that that doubt persists is a day that hopefully use of force, the force will not be used. So this is a central question, I think, animating the US administration at the moment. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion of this with our panel. So let me introduce my fellow panelists. First on the screen, you have the wonderful General Phil Breedlove, who I had the privilege of working with when I was in the Pentagon and he was a commander. He is a distinguished professor of practice here at the Nunn School, but he's also former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe, so commander of all of NATO, and US European Command commander. He currently sits on the board of directors at the Atlantic Council. He's also had some interesting experience of his own with Taiwan, leading a delegation that was received by President Tsai in 2018, but also when he was a commander in the Air Force, helping to train Taiwan's Air Force wings. And so we're very pleased to have General Breedlove with us. We also have Dr. Robert Bell, who's also a distinguished professor here of practice here at the Nunn School. He's also the CEO of his own consulting firm, also a cute name called National Security Council, like SEL as opposed to CIL, where he served. He has worked, has a brilliant career in defense in the US, has worked with the US Air Force, the Senate Committees on Foreign Relations and Armed Services, and was a longtime official at NATO. He served as the senior civilian representative of the Secretary of Defense in Europe and defense advisor to the US Ambassador to NATO from 2010 to 2017. So great to have Bob Bell here with us. You all know Dr. Elberg. He is the professor and chair of the Sam Nunn School here. His research interests are incredibly varied, but include the geopolitics of energy, security dilemmas and statecraft in Eurasia, Russia and gray zone conflict. So he's been busy with Ukraine, and just broader approaches, new approaches to strategic stability. He is a very much sought after consultant to RAND, to the Center for Nonproliferation Studies, the Office of Net Assessment, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So great to have you with us. And then finally, last but not least, Dr. John, who has, I believe, a dual appointment at the Nunn School and also at the School of Cybersecurity and Privacy here at Georgia Tech. He is the leading voice on cybersecurity, intelligence studies, deterrence in the modern era, and the sociology of technology, widely published author and Professor here. So without further ado, I want to get us started on the conversation and I want to stop talking. So I want to start by just asking each of you to spend a few minutes to say, how do you frame this problem? And what are the lessons from you that you think apply from Ukraine or don't apply from Ukraine? So start with Bob.
Well, I think there are two lessons that really jump out immediately from our experience with Ukraine, recognizing that this is a story whose ending has not been written yet. But I think the first and most obvious lesson from Ukraine is that it is critical for the world, for the international rules-based order, for the future of democracies globally, that Russia not win in Ukraine. We cannot allow a precedent where a nuclear armed power invades, conquers, subjugates, and eradicates a non-nuclear democracy. So the first obvious thing we can do to help Taiwan in its relationship with the PRC is to keep doing what we're doing with Ukraine to try to create the conditions for some semblance of a Ukrainian victory, recognizing that there are different definitions of what winning for Ukraine would be. And I think the second lesson that really jumps out to me is that at the end of the day, the first responsibility for protecting your sovereignty, your integrity, your way of life, your culture, your language, your government, your freedom is self-help. The first responsibility in any relationship of allies or partners is the country concerned has to want its freedom more than anybody else. In other words, the United States can't want Ukraine's freedom more than the Ukrainians want it. The United States couldn't want Taiwanese freedom more than the Taiwanese want it. Not in any way suggesting the Taiwanese do not want their freedom. But if you look at even within NATO, the NATO treaty, which has its famous Article 5 mutual security guarantee, all for one and all for one, we will come if you're attacked, invoked by NATO in our case after 9/11. So that Article 5 is sort of a gold standard for an alliance relationship. But there's also Article 3 in the NATO treaty. And Article 3 says, in effect, the first responsibility of every ally is to build its own resilience through self-help, a point that Michelle made in her introduction. So we can't just say, Taiwan, forget it, we've got it. You know, we will take the first and foremost responsibility. This has to be a partnership from the beginning. We have to be sensitive to the Taiwanese, as Shelley developed very well in her remarks. And we had to make sure that everyone understands that self-help and self-defense is the first line of defense.
Yeah, why don't we pass it down?
Well, let me just say, I think one of the first observations that I have about deterrence and the lessons from the war in Ukraine is that when we look at the war in Ukraine, deterrence failed. We are in a war. We are watching. Russia made a choice to invade and use force in Ukraine. But that lesson does not necessarily have to transport to Taiwan. And there are a variety of reasons, and I think we heard for some of them, and Michelle referenced some of them, but I would I would want to make 2 points to that. One is I think that Russia's approach to confrontation and competition in the context of Ukraine may be a little bit more, maybe different than China's, notwithstanding common, regime types, notwithstanding the similar range of instruments that they would like to bring to bear, but the internal logics of their approach to coercion, I think, are different. Maybe we can talk more about that. But the other thing Back to it. The point I'm making is I think that we have to keep in mind that U.S. posture towards Ukraine, both prior to February of 2022 and today, has been very explicit about not directly getting involved. And notwithstanding the problems and challenges of demonstrating our commitment to Taiwan, but I think it raises more questions in the adversary's mind, I think, than was in the case with Ukraine, and whether or not Putin was right and intoxicated by much of the hubris and his own narratives. Notwithstanding those issues, I think that for the Russians, Ukraine was an opportunity and was perceived to be a relatively low-cost opportunity. And the strategy they initially brought to bear reflected that. Now, of course, that's not how things have necessarily turned out. But as we've heard from both Michelle and Shelley, that the strategic equation in the Indo-Pacific is much different. There's much more risk of escalation and a much more costly enterprise, such that that decision will not be an easy one for anybody. So I would let me just stop here by suggesting we need to be careful about how much we import from the Ukraine strategic context to the Taiwan strategic context.
Great, thank you very much. I have a few other thoughts on deterrence in general, but the question was on Ukraine, so I'll focus on that. One, maybe nuanced conversation that I would have with Adam is about the failure of deterrence. I think it's helpful to think about deterrence not as a binary on-off switch that made a lot of sense in early deterrence theory, where the idea was avoiding World War III, right? And so any release of nuclear weapons is failure. But we can also think of deterrence as a rheostat, right? So there are things that you must deter and must prevent. There are things that you don't prevent, right? So, a lot of my work looks at both deterrence and cybersecurity. War is a rare event. The purpose of deterrence is to keep it that way. Cyber conflict flourishes all the time. It's incredibly frequent, right? So cyber conflict, in fact, is frequent where war is absent. I think it's important when we think about the war in Ukraine and why do we not see a lot of consequential cyber activity. This is a story of an actor that has decided that their interests will be best served in war, not in gray zone conflict. So when I look at the war in Ukraine, right, I actually see at least 3 different conflicts going on. One is the very obvious one, which is this high intensity combined arms conflict on the ground, right, the largest land combat activity in Europe since the Second World War. The other one, incredibly important in the back of everybody's mind, sometimes in the forefront, is the nuclear containment of this conflict to the borders of Ukraine. And both sides have made it fairly clear that the spillover of this war, either to the west into NATO nations or to the east into the territory of Russia, would potentially trigger an escalation, something nobody wants. And then there is this third war, right, which is the end of the gray zone conflict that lasted from 2014 to the beginning of 2022 and continues to be relevant outside of Ukraine. So we have this interesting situation. If you think about our lovely acronym DIME, diplomacy, information, military, and economics. We have all 4 of these in action with Ukraine. We have D on the nuclear side, right? Deterrence, right? Which is a diplomatic commitment, right? Keeping this war contained. We have a high intensity military conflict. Russia is leading big time with the M. And in order to keep Ukraine in the game, right, the United States has been playing both the I, intelligence, information operations, consolidating support for Ukraine, and of course the E side, right, making sure there is funding and support for this effort, and their his effort to continue to squeeze Russia. So there's I think something important to be taken there, that integrating all of these instruments of national power is going to be a very important thing going forward. And perhaps if Russia would have understood that there would have been this integration over the long term, there would have been perhaps less of a chance that Putin would have gambled on a short war in the beginning. Thank you. And General Breedlove, over to you.
Okay, thank you. First of all, fascinating first session. Thank you for that. Can you all hear me? Give me a big thumbs up. Okay, great. And second of all, what a panel to be on, people that I've looked up to for a long time on this panel. And so thank you for having me. To stay within my time limit, I'm going to hit three things very quickly: U.S. policy, military thoughts and actions, and then I'd be remiss as an airman if I didn't talk a tiny bit about air power. So the first thing I would say on U.S. policy, what we could learn and do better in Taiwan is to have a clear, unambiguous, and declaratory policy towards what will happen vis-a-vis Taiwan. In Ukraine, we have been, I think, ill-served by some rather gray policy. We say we're going to be there as long as it takes. We say we're going to give them everything they need. Well, a military planner or a military commander, those are incomplete sentences. We're going to be there for as long as it takes to do what? We're going to give them everything they need to do what? And by clearly outlining the to do what, we could better understand what it's going to take to get to the right place in Ukraine. The second thing that is very worrisome to me and other military planners now is that, and this relates directly to Taiwan, is that we need to fight the tendency to build sanctuary for our opponents. In Ukraine, we have allowed, if you want to use that word, or we have tolerated Russia firing from nearly 300 degrees around the compass into Ukraine. Russia attacks from in the north, Belarus, all the way around through Russia into the south-southwest, meaning the northern Black Sea. And yet we forbid Ukraine from using any of the Western supplied weapons to fire back into Russia. Russia completely understands that they have sanctuary, freedom of maneuver, and this is a problem for a military commander to overcome. I bring this up because many say that in all instances in a conflict with China over Ukraine, we will avoid striking the mainland. And I think this needs to be something that needs to be discussed up front. Will we build the same sanctuary from which China can fight and then have to defend Taiwan only on Taiwan or in Taiwan's air and sea spaces? Secondly, as to military thinking. So we military guys study the folks we call the old dead guys, Clausewitz, Sun Tzu, Jomini. And these guys say a lot of things in their own words, but two things that they consistently say is in a conflict or a competition, you should seize the initiative. And secondary has been well discussed, you should deter your enemy and not allow yourself to be deterred. In our conflict in Ukraine, we are behind the 8 ball on both of those. We ceded the initiative to Russia early in the war because we kept saying, if you do this, we're going to do this. If you do this, we're going to do this. This is classic ceding the initiative to the enemy and being reactive. And secondarily, as has already been well discussed, we have been nearly fully deterred in Ukraine, and our enemy is completely undeterred in Ukraine. And so I think in the context of a Chinese conflict with Taiwan, we need to focus more on what they fear rather than on what we fear. We acknowledged our fears early in the conflict in Ukraine, and Russia plays them back to us now almost on a daily basis. nuclear war, why general war, Americans dying on the battlefield. We transmitted those fears and they pay them back to us now consistently. And then finally, to get off the stage as an airman, I was proud to command the Taiwanese training unit at Luke Air Force Base. I flew with their pilots. I visited their country. I visited all of their air bases. And frankly, the Taiwanese Air Force is in a very, very different place than Ukraine's is. They are a very capable Air Force. They have very, very capable and dedicated pilots, and they will fight at a high level in a 4th to 5th generational way. And we need to make sure that we give them the tools to be able to sustain that fight to defend the air and sea space around Taiwan. Okay, thanks. I'm sure I've made someone angry, and I expect incoming fire in the questions.
Not at all. Thank you so much, General Breedlove. So if we're focused on deterrence, you know, we really are trying to deter a specific decision maker or set of decision makers. I would have said decision makers in a prior era in China where we had more of a collective leadership. Now she is quite dominant in that. But we, you know, during the Cold War, we had a whole cottage industry of, you know, think tanks and academia and specialists who really tried to get inside the Soviet leadership, the mind of the Politburo, to understand what would actually affect their decision making, what would cause them to be deterred from war. And I don't feel that we have the same depth of understanding or coherence of effort to really understand what would deter the Chinese leadership from deciding to use force against Taiwan. And so I wanted to offer a little bit of discussion on that. You know, what do we know and believe would deter Xi in particular, but the leadership in general? And what do we not know that we need to better understand to be confident in our ability to deter? So who wants to take the first stab at that?
Happy to suggest a couple of lines of thought on that, Michelle. There's obviously a debate on this, and there's no consensus. Last month, the Biden administration released its annual threat assessment. And what you learn on this issue, reading that, is quite interesting. It argues, the intelligence community argues, that China is effectively deterred right now because they fear a U.S. nuclear first strike. Interesting observation, particularly President Biden has struggled to settle his own view about whether a first strike should even be part of our doctrine. Right now, because of Ukraine, it is, but that was in debate. So what the threat assessment says is that Xi is ordered his military to engage in a massive nuclear buildup, and we're all aware of some of the statistics in terms of the hundreds of ICBM silos and the sort of the projection of where the PRC may end up, precisely because he wants to sort of neutralize our nuclear recourse, if you will, which will then allow him to be much more aggressive with a conventional threat, an invasion threat for Taiwan. And the 2027 time, so not deadline, but capability option target comes in because that's when the Chinese are projecting that their nuclear buildup will get to a point where we have, in effect, mutual assured destruction. But there's another point of view that's been quite prominent in the last year, and it's held by our U.S. Strategic Command and by a majority in the Congress, and that is that there is a deterrence gap today on our side. Admiral Richard and General Cotton from the Strategic Command have talked about a deterrence and assurance gap. In other words, the Strategic Command's position today is that we are self-deterred, and Taiwan knows it, and Japan knows it, and our European allies know it, so they're not assured. And their argument is that this gap can only be closed if we deploy a nuclear version of the Sea Launch Cruise Missile, a new nuclear system that President Biden has tried to avoid building that the Trump administration had originally proposed to be refunded. So it's an interesting disconnect between the intelligence community conclusion on the one hand and strategic command on the other. And it's even more of a disconnect if you consider that our intelligence community is saying that what the PRC fears most is a US nuclear first strike. And yet the system that Strategic Command is suggesting, a cruise missile with a nuclear warhead on it, is slow and aerodynamic and susceptible to air defenses and is generally not thought of as a first strike system.
Other thoughts on what we need to deter?
I'd like to jump in after Adam. Oh, excuse me.
Go ahead.
I would just offer that maybe we should look a little bit at history, and I'm really in trouble in shallow water here or deep water when I talk about Chinese history. But it seems that across history, China has fallen internally almost more than externally, and so that Xi and his leadership are focused at least some degree to internal control. And if we were to cause problems in that internal control, and I think the easiest way is economically, and if we were able to sort of invalidate or challenge the mandate of heaven, which connects Xi to his people, if he can't meet their economic expectations, then he will have a lot of problems. And so I think that one of the tools we should consider using is how could we economically separate Xi from the promises that the Chinese people believe have been made them and their expectations in their life.
Great, thanks. So I think deterrence is not only a rheostat, it's actually a bundle of many different things. When we talk about deterrence, we're actually talking about multiple objectives. The obvious one is avoiding a war. Okay, that seems straightforward, strategic stability, but appeasement will avoid a war also. So we also want something else. We want something like influence over the status quo, right? And maybe not just preserving it, maybe improving it, okay? The other side may get worried about what that is and debate about what the status quo really looks like. So influence is going to require absorbing some risk, which is against the other goal, right? There's another couple of goals. One is we'd like to do all of these things without breaking the bank. This is part of why deterrence is attractive. We've heard it said many times that a war in Taiwan would be an absolute catastrophe, and it would. Therefore, we must deter because deterrence is going to be cheaper than that war. And therein lies the problem, right? The other side says, really, are you deterring because you want to influence, or are you deterring because you're not willing to pay the cost of that war, right? Deterrence itself can be costly. You need to send signals that are credible. The credible ones tend to be costly, right? Maybe you have other ways of doing things that will be more affordable. And then, of course, we usually hear we need to be prepared to fight a war in case deterrence fails. And that preparation will be part of deterrence. This is deterrence by denial. But some of the things that we do to win a war are different than the things we do to deter a war. In a war, we do a lot of maneuver, we do a lot of surprise, we use maybe some cyber and electronic warfare, exquisite capabilities that you cannot reveal, which means these are part of the military power that you use to win the war that you cannot use to deter, because then you lose those capabilities. So when I think about the question, how to deter a Taiwan war, right? I think about the debate here. There's kind of these four very different options, and I think they are optimizing on these different objectives. And just to make it easier for you to remember, I'll describe them as working, watching, winning, and warning. Okay, this is working with China. All right, watching costs and intelligence, winning the war against China, and warning about costly consequences. So the first one, which has kind of been the default strategy during the 1990s and 2010s, right, has been engagement. This is emphasizing stability, emphasizing win-win prosperity, right, taking advantage of interdependence in the global economy, interdependence between Taiwan and China, right? And obviously that's changing, okay? This movement towards decoupling, this recognition that the pure kind of working strategy is not working. There is an extreme version of this. It's not going to be popular in this room, but I'll just get it out on the table, right? This is the accommodation strategy that's been suggested by Charlie Glazer and others, right? That say stability is the #1 American interest. Make a grand bargain with China. There's nothing else that will start World War III. Let's deal with that. So again, I'll just mention that. Number two, right, is kind of where, again, by default we are now. I call this watching. I mean watching costs. I also mean intelligence to watch your adversary. Intelligence is great. It's an efficiency strategy that allows you to target more precisely, that gives you alternatives other than war. It allows you to improve the efficiency of what you can do. And so this leads you into the realm of gray zone conflict, subversion, intelligence. And of course, this is a big deal across the strait right now, right? This is kind of the ongoing conflict that we don't talk about. I would say there is an aspect of the cost strategy, which I would call kind of the offshore balancing strategy, which is also our default approach right now, which is let's rely on, you know, U.S. nuclear deterrence and naval forces that are offshore, right? And maybe we'll use them, maybe we don't. We hope they will provide deterrence, but the problem is they are providing low-cost economic options for the United States, not necessarily the best thing for deterrence. So number three, all right, let's move on to winning the war, right? Michelle's been a wonderful advocate of this position, right? And this is idea like, let's find a way to redress the declining balance of power right now. Early concepts were called air-sea battle. We now talk about multi-domain operations. This is a story about building up power, coming up with new concepts, coming up with new technologies in order to offset Chinese capabilities, fight through and roll back Chinese anti-access area denial A2AD capabilities, okay? This is going to be very, very costly, which raises questions about credibility. It may involve having to strike the mainland. We need a kind of a free hand there. And this is optimizing for power. Okay, it's optimizing for power, and it's going to be using a lot of mobile and exquisite capabilities that may be difficult to discuss. So we can move on to the fourth one, warning. All right. This is also not popular, but let's just kind of get all of them on the table, right? Whereas the first one, working, was kind of an economics first strategy. The second one, watching, was an intelligence information strategy. The third one, winning, was a military strategy. This one is a diplomatic strategy, and it includes things like a very clear declaratory policy about what the United States is willing to do. It may include diplomatic recognition under some circumstances. It probably depends on more forward deployments of U.S. troops in Asian allies, if not even working with Taiwan. We've got lots of empirical data that show that forward deployed forces tend to have a stabilizing force relative to naval forces and other things. And it is a willingness to think about the long term. God forbid, if there's a war, turning A2AD against China, right, creating a denial environment that would make it very, very difficult for China to operate across the strait, to think seriously about distant blockade options, which means putting a long-term strain on the Chinese economy and the viability, and to make it clear, right, that this is going to be a long and painful fight, okay? All of these are extremely costly, but they are focused on trying to improve influence rather than power, cost, and stability. So I kind of just throw all these out there, right? You can't just say, hey, I like one or the other, let's kind of combine them. It comes down to, what do you want? Tell me what you want, what you really want, right? And this is something that the United States is not good at. What many countries are not good at. We want to hedge. We want lots and lots of things. So my worst fear is that number one working has failed. We've kind of slid into the low cost strategy, watching number two. We would like to have number three, but that's going to be a very, very expensive, heavy lift domestically in the United States, which is going to tempt China to go for the quick and easy short war, right? And then we're going to find ourselves in number four. Deterrence has failed, but we don't want to give up. And now we need to decide diplomatically, are we in it for the long term? So if that progression is possible, and it looks a little bit like the Ukraine progression, maybe we should start thinking about what we're willing to do up front. Thank you.
Let me just add a few words. I'm not a sinologist, but I do want to address the last part of Michelle's question, which is what do we need to know? And so the one who looks at Russia and that equation, there are several things. There's several questions I think we need answers to. Is one, when it comes to deterrence, are we playing the same deterrence game? In other words, there's been a lot of discussion about ends, what China's goals would be versus what Russia's goals would be. There's a lot of discussion about means, what are the different dime elements and the combinations of the dime elements. But I think one of the areas we don't know enough about are the ways, and has to do with the logics that link those ends and means. And looking at Russia, I think it's very clear they have a very different concept of deterrence that is not just about way we think about it, which is discouraging an adversary from doing something, but they blend elements of compellence and containment in their concept. In addition, their concept of deterrent, or our concept of deterrence, relies heavily, as we just heard, on demonstrating credibility, right, and commitment. Theirs is and making things explicit. Hence, we talk a lot about red lines and things like that. Their concept of deterrence puts a premium on uncertainty, creating doubt, confusion, having us stumble onto our own differences, such that, as General Breedlove mentioned, we may become self-deterred. So the question is, what is China's ways of deterrence? That's one question we need to answer. Also, what is, if it's stability that we need to pursue, what is their definition of stability and strategic stability? This was something that we embarked on with Russia prior to the kinetic phase of the conflict, and even since the Crimean annexation. But I would submit that our understandings of strategic stability were very different. Yes, there was an overlap and there's a legacy of the Cold War nuclear dimension, but for us, strategic stability has a lot to do with discouraging or creating disincentives to escalate or to race in arms or to go to war in a crisis. And for us, we were broadening that to include not just the offensive nuclear systems, but also defensive nuclear systems, maybe space, and maybe some exotic weaponry. The Russian concept involved those plus non-kinetic dimensions and a whole host of other domains that were not really part of the way we think about strategic stability. So again, the question is, how do the Chinese, how does the PRC think about strategic stability? Not only the complexity of it. And finally, as John was talking about, deterrence is really about cost, benefits, and probabilities, and in essence, expected utility calculations. And we've talked about how complicated that is in the Indo-Pacific arena. But the real problem for deterrence is when you run up against a risk taker, somebody that doesn't play by those rules. And the question is, where's that inflection point going to be? Is it going to be about the security of the regime? And as a result, those where we want to be careful about where we push too far, because that may lead to a gambler's mentality and posture, or is it going to be in affecting the costs and the risks in the more of the strategic dimension? So I think those are some of the questions we need to be able to answer moving forward.
Great, thank you so much. So now I want to turn to a different, but I think the central question, which is, how do we help Taiwan prepare? How do we help Taiwan, posture itself to contribute to the prevention of war? I think there are a couple of different aspects to this. You know, I'm sure that one of the things, well, I'm guessing that one of the things that really has disturbed, you know, President Xi has been seeing the extent of the Ukrainian people's willingness to stand up and resist, and the resilience and strength of Ukrainian society in the face of aggression. And I think there's been a increasing amount of talk inside Taiwan and with the US and others about how do you strengthen a society that already has a lot of cohesion and resilience, but how do you strengthen that still further? President Tsai has introduced this notion of the all-out mobilization agency, which wants to build on, you know, the civil society organizations, whether it's, you know, volunteer paramedics or firefighters or nurses or, you know, what have you, and how do you pull that together in a moment of national crisis to really augment resilience? And then there's the military dimension, where people have talked about what's now called the porcupine strategy, which is, you know, how do you help Taiwan adopt a more asymmetric and layered defense so that it really looks pretty indigestible to the more indigestible, more difficult to take on by a superior conventional force in the PLA. So, so I want to ask you, each of you, to think about, or to talk a little bit about, what are the most important things we can do to help Taiwan build its own resilience and defense. And since we are at Georgia Tech, I'm going to invite people to talk about any specific technologies or capabilities that might be part of that mix, if you're so moved. But so, General Breedlove, we're going to start with you, and then we'll go down the line of the panel. Thanks.
I'm a subscriber to the porcupine thought. Amphibious landings are very, very tough. And as we have seen the PRC react to the 2 political visits that they most disliked across the past several weeks and months, they haven't shown us really the look of an amphibious landing. They've shown us more of a blockading or air and naval approach. And so I think that we need to reinforce, as you mentioned, Madam Secretary, we need to reinforce what is happening in Ukraine, and that is that an attacking force in the face of technical capabilities to strike at range will make it incredibly costly, and we keep focused on that. As I mentioned in my remarks, we need to allow, enable, and help Taiwan to become even better at its own defense. As was mentioned by Bob earlier, the Article 3 idea of defense starts at home, and air defense and coastal defense, cruise missile defense will be key here, and we have a lot to offer in those places.
Right, thank you, Bob.
Well, I certainly agree with General Breedlove. Air defense and missile defense are key. We have to focus on the likely scenarios, and I think the consensus is that in sort of a naval version of a blitzkrieg, Taiwan would be facing an amphibious assault. But to prepare the battlefield for those landing craft to assemble and come across 100 miles of open sea vulnerability, obviously the PRC would try to start out by neutralizing the systems on Taiwan that could interdict that invasion fleet, setting aside maybe attack submarines. So missile defense and air defense would be key. And last, I was quite intrigued. Of course, we all living with this incredible story of all the leaked documents from the Air National Guard airmen in Massachusetts. But one of the ones, which I have not read, I've only read the Washington Post account of it, examines vulnerabilities today of Taiwan to sort of a short notice. I'm not talking about a blockade, which would be built up over time, but a short notice coup de main kind of attack by the PRC to try to get a quick result, what the Russians had hoped to do in Ukraine. And they were worried about Chinese special forces being on commercial ships that are going every day to Taiwan and having sort of military forces disguised on these ships that could then quickly neutralize political and communications points of sensitivity on the island and confuse your ability to have a coherent defense. And I couldn't help but think about a parallel to that, perhaps because my wife is Danish. But when World War II started for Denmark, the Germans put 500 special forces guys on a freighter, which came in with cargo and was anchored right next to the Little Mermaid, if any of you have been to Copenhagen. And at dawn on D-Day, the hatches opened and these 500 special forces guys quickly got ashore and seized all the relevant political and military leadership of the Danish armed forces, which completely confused and crippled the Danish defense, and they surrendered within 4 hours.
So I guess hewing to the panel's focus on some of the lessons from Ukraine and with respect to what can we do to help Taiwan, I think one of the things we need to do is really reflect on some of the non-kinetic elements to our posture, especially with respect to economic sanctions and energy statecraft. And I think that the first thing we need to do when we look at those scenarios that Bob is mentioning and the scenarios that would lead up to those kinetic outcomes has to do with looking at that complex set of relationships, the trading, the financial dimensions, the supply chain dimensions that are very different with respect to Taiwan and China than with respect to Russia. And so the first thing we need to really do is distinguish our understanding of impact of sanctions from the actual strategic effectiveness of these sanctions. And so that's one thing we need to take into account. The other thing is on the energy front, we need to do, there's a lot of attention to the complementarity of Russia and China and how China is a beneficiary of the war, of Russia's war in Ukraine as the flow of gas and oil is increased. But in a war that takes place in the Taiwan Straits context, the energy markets are going to respond to almost the exact opposite, because China's vulnerability is going to be sea interdiction and the lack of their ability to get their heavily reliant imports. And so just as we've been talking about, the scenarios involving blockades of Taiwan, I think we need to walk through the scenarios of the sea interdiction to China and what that will do to the energy markets for the sustainability of any kind of pressure on China. And here you're going to see you could likely see a situation, if completely successful, right? The estimates are you could maybe hurt China's economy by about 17% by preventing, in the absolute context of all of the imported natural gas and oil. And that's going to that's going to lead to a glut in the global market, as opposed to the shortages that we saw with the Russian case, which is going to lead to downward prices in the international community, which is going to then put pressure on any kind of economic and energy statecraft on the part of other producers on the US and others to shirk that. So that's going to be a very different energy equation that's going to come out of any kind of rising intense conflict over the Straits than we see in Europe with the Ukrainian case. So I would say we need to start getting out in front of what that looks like and how sustainable are any of these sanctions that would be there, not only to have some sort of impact, but to actually move the needle strategically.
Sure. In talking about the cyber, I want to actually tie back to your first question on Ukraine, right? So the war now was preceded by this long gray zone conflict. And I think that was an interesting one because my interpretation was that deterrence was very successful. And so Russia reached not for this amazing gray zone secret weapon that it has, but kind of the second or third best option, right? You do a little bit of gray zone and little green men when you're not actually willing to kind of go up against NATO. And then we really kind of improved Ukraine's ability to wage that kind of conflict. Russia's fortunes were not looking good in the Donbass. They really got teched up on the cyber side. And so then Russia had to say, well, I can either let this gray zone conflict go on and lose Kyiv, or I can escalate to the next level. And so that's what they did, right? And so the irony was that we kind of took away the gray zone option by improving our defenses in the gray zone, and then Russia had nowhere to go other than up. And so I think about that a little bit in the Taiwan scenario, but ask myself, like, well, what are the gray zone options, right? So right now we've got this incredible kind of cyber exchange going on right now, very, very active, huge concerns about, whether the ROC military is penetrated, how much you can trust people that you're dealing with, how much they can trust their own systems, back and forth. There's opportunities and threats on all sides. That's a kind of very active thing right now. But what do kind of higher levels of gray zone conflict look like, kind of short of kind of China making the jump towards an amphibious invasion, right? That's the one thing that's very different about Taiwan rather than Ukraine, is that you've got this natural moat, which gives you this step function. When you've kind of reached the next level and started this off, and China may be a little bit reticent to do that. So there's missile barrages, there's blockades, there's economic activity, there's all kinds of space and cyber proxies with the United States that might happen first, which could end up making this a much bigger war than if China actually did kind of take the jump into, a full, kind of amphibious invasion of Taiwan. And then we're thinking about, this long-term horror show story. So, my worry in the Russian side was that we kind of took away the gray zone option. There was somewhere else for them to go. But in the China case, there may not be somewhere else to go, because that is so bad, so catastrophic for each side. There's so much kind of nuclear risk that's involved. Now, maybe there may be these larger kind of gray zone possibilities that are going to be happening throughout the global economy. I think we need to think a lot harder about what those sorts of interactions are going to look like, which would make the cyber more important. I'm not a huge believer in kind of the potency of cyber in the middle of armed conflict. Cyber depends on a lot of kind of peacetime planning assumptions and cooperative interactions and connections across adversaries. It's wonderful in peacetime, short of war. Once the balloon goes up and you've got all the Clausewitzian fog and friction, right? This is not the time where cyber comes into its own. But if we think that we can deter China from going all the way, but it's then going to start interacting in the middle, then cyber, economic statecraft, all of these other things are going to become far more important.
Wonderful. So now is the time to open it up to your questions. I have more if we have people who are too shy, but I think we'll have some good questions. So please, sir. Yes.
As a Taiwanese American, we're talking about deterrence, right? So we all know what Taiwan needs in terms of deterrence. So I'm just going to ask a very blunt question. General Breedlove, so as someone that is very familiar with Taiwanese Air Force, when do you think that the United States should provide F-35 to Taiwanese Air Force so they can fight a more equal war?
General Breedlove.
So it's a great question, and may I not dodge the question, but may I add a broad answer, and that is air defense and air power is bigger than just the airplane, and that's tough for a fighter pilot to say, and it's tough for an F-16 pilot to say. But to make Taiwan more defensible and make them more deterrent in the eyes of China, it is newer and more capable and stealthy aircraft. Yes, it is a more dense missile interceptor network, and probably even more important is a very resilient, because it will come under attack, very resilient system of radars and sensors and command and control, such that we can see, characterize, target, and then engage the right things coming across the straits. So I applaud your concern about the aircraft. I think the JSF is an important part of Taiwan's future, but in the very short term, more dense missile defense, more dense air defense, and more dense sensing and command and control will reap immediate benefits.
Just one view on F-35. If you assume what President Biden has said 4 times, we will help and we will defend Taiwan if there's an attack by China. If you assume that China believes that, in any Chinese attack planning, they're probably going to go after our Air Force assets in the region, which means strikes against bases in Japan, among other things. So it's sort of hard to imagine a conflict, high intensity conflict scenario for Taiwan that doesn't engage other allies in the region. And if you look at the region in terms of who has F-35s, F-35s would be in the fight. They could be Japanese, they could be US, they could be Australian. So the question is, does it make sense for Taiwan itself, whose defense budget is only 1/10 that of China, to spend the amount of money they would have to spend to get their own F-35s into the fight, when you assume there would be a coalition in which F-35s would already be there?
Yes, sir.
Feeling Wang here again at Nunn School. I think Michelle mentioned the point is critical. That is how to convince Xi Jinping and his associates that it doesn't pay to invade, right? Sort of instill something in their head, the cost benefit analysis we in the West and in Taiwan share, kind of it's not worthwhile to attack. And with that, and I think Phil's comment is really also targeted, pointed. That is, where to draw the line? Do we want to tell the Chinese that specifically US military force will never ever touch mainland China if you invade, which is limited to Taiwan, right? That seems to be irrational. So the critical thing here is to build on John's logic is to have the Chinese appreciate the symmetrical utility function we have with them. What is in the head of Chinese leadership with what we have in our mind probably is not the same. So there you go, Adam. I heard your marching orders, right? To understand the Chinese mindset, that's really critical. So my question is very simple here. That is, based on what Shelley had told us very convincingly, very firmly, that we should not recognize Taiwan as a sovereign country, at least not for now, right? So therefore, my question is, given that Ukraine was a fully sovereign country, guaranteed by a number of things, including the deal signed to denuclearize Ukraine back, when, right? Russia still attacked, right? Now we have only basic presidential promises, verbal promises, and some very gray area, kind of ambiguous kind of obligations, right? How should the Chinese read that as a serious kind of a real guarantee for Taiwan? And so therefore make the deterrence credible, especially given that the West has been trying to limit the war in Ukraine only to Ukraine, not to touch Russia. So if I was sitting in Beijing, based on what I know about what they want and what they fear, right? I actually would probably willing to give it a gamble, give it a try, take the risk, because one, you're not going to touch me, you're going to limit it in Taiwan, and two, you just have a one presidential verbal guarantee, right? The next president thinks otherwise. Finally, you don't even recognize Taiwan as a sovereign country. You think Taiwan is kind of a non-entity, right? You will put your life, American life, and American money online to deal with me, and knowing I'm determined to solve the problem because it's all I care about my political region survival, about my historical mission, 5,000 years, you name it, right? All this stuff. So that may actually the kind of asymmetry we need to overcome. So great panel discussion, but I would wonder if we have some kind of ideas how to convince the Chinese, yes, asymmetrical, but your utility function is not right. We have something to convince you that please, no fighting. Right?
Well, I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair to give you my 2 cents on this question, but I'm also going to invite others as well. I think President Biden has gone about as far as a president can go. Maybe he can go a little further within, stopping short of recognizing Taiwan and taking the risk that would provoke exactly what we're trying to prevent from China. To be saying, look, if there's a use of force to unilaterally change the status quo unprovoked, you can expect the United States to defend Taiwan. He said it in many ways, many times. I also think that Chinese military planners, from what we know, assume the US will engage. And a lot of their planning is early cyber and space attacks to try to prevent our mobilization and all kinds of things. So they assume we're going to be there, and they're really looking at this question of how can we create, a rapid fait accompli before the US fully responds or before the US arrives. And I do think one of the things we need to do is continue to clarify our political commitment and that we won't tolerate unilateral changes to the status quo, but also to think strategically about a bit of a reveal and conceal strategy. We've got to be developing flexible deterrent options, things that we can do in a crisis to create uncertainty or doubt for Xi. And you have to think very carefully about, are there some surprises we could reveal that would really, there's not going to be a silver bullet, but are there a series of things that we could do that would shake his confidence on the PLA's ability to deliver a quick fait accompli? Clearly, Putin was overconfident in Ukraine. We want to create that same doubt now in light of that for Xi. But anybody else want to jump in on this point? John?
Well, I think this actually does raise one interesting aspect of the cyber conflict, right? And it's when you look at there is an asymmetry in how the US and Taiwan think about the information space and how the Chinese think about it, which is all about information control, right? And they built this, great firewall architecture and lots of other things, which is another way of saying this is something that they value a great deal, right? Which means it's a counter value target if you're interested in deterrence. And, the United States in particular has inoculated itself against information influence. Our internal dialogue is so feisty and poisonous in so many ways that it actually makes it very difficult to influence us. We're very good at influencing ourselves. And so, there is an opportunity, right, to invert the Russian fire hose of falsehood strategy with the fire hose of truth and information, start taking down, right, that information infrastructure and make sure that the Chinese people understand what the real balance of power is, what the real, consequences are, and perhaps start to educate the regime about what its costs may be in a long-term war. I'm not sure that I totally agree with this idea, but it's worth thinking about because, again, cyber is not useful in the war. It can send some very strange signals. The signals that it usually sends are, I'm doing cyber because I don't want to escalate, but I care about this thing, right? And so it may be interesting in that crisis situation to have some half measures like this. The Chinese are going to assume that the mainland Chinese are going to assume that we're interfering in their information space anyway. Why don't we? It's something they're concerned about. It telegraphs the consequences of a long-term conflict to the regime. It's something we need to think about, whether that would actually get through to Xi or not.
So I'm going to argue in a sense that Taiwan has gotten more from President Biden, who, as Michelle said, has 4 times said, we will defend you if there's an attack, than Ukraine got in the Budapest Memorandum. I say that because when I was on the NSC staff for President Clinton, I was very involved in the negotiation of the Budapest Memorandum. And what the Budapest Memorandum was a list, a reminder in which Russia reminded Ukraine of all the previous treaties it had signed that said Russia would respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. So the operative verb, if you will, in the Budapest Memorandum is reaffirm. Russia reaffirmed its pledge under the UN Charter. Russia reaffirmed its pledges under the Helsinki Final Act. But there was no security guarantee whatsoever. No, you're right. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons to get this set of reminders. The French have a wonderful term called pour mémoire. If you've accepted a dinner invitation, then a week before the dinner, you get a note that says pour mémoire to remind you that you've made this commitment. But we didn't offer Ukraine a security guarantee. The only obligation for the United States, other than to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity in the Budapest Memorandum, was to say that if someone else broke that, like Russia invaded, we would call for consultations, which we did to no avail, because Russia then declared that the Budapest Memorandum had been invalidated by Ukraine itself and was no longer in effect.
Just say two things in terms of credible signals that could be sent. And I would agree completely with Michelle that we need to be thinking about sowing doubt with respect to a fait accompli strategy that may be pursued. And I think that's one of the lessons from the war in Ukraine. The other one that I would suggest is that right now, and again, I'm not a sinologist and I defer to you, but a lot of the attention, Taiwan is seen as different than the more global strategy that that PRC seems to be playing, which is really trying to underscore, especially using a variety of tactics, their peaceful nature, the sort of inducement side of things, and that they can have they can spread their influence that way. And I think that one part of the deterrence strategy on Taiwan will be to link the costs to what they do in the region to undermining that. And again, here I think the lesson from the Russian war in Ukraine is how that war has brought together not just our alliances and our relationships with our partners in Europe, but also how that's transcended to our posture in Indo-Pacific, notwithstanding Macron's most recent visit. But even the backlash to that suggests that there's more of a convergence among us there. So I think in tying the costs to whatever they would do, not only to sowing doubt with respect to the fait accompli strategy, but undermining any of those other global ambitions through the strategy they're pursuing now.
General Breedlove, you talked earlier about clarifying declaratory policy. Anything else you want to add on this question, or should we take the next one?
I think take the next one. I would just be repeating. I think it's really important that we not have a gray zone on what we say about Taiwan.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, you've been very patient. Microphone's coming.
I know it's speculation, but what are what were the things that we missed, if any, for deterrence in the Ukraine war that would have made a difference, and what other factors would have made a difference to prevent Russia from invading Ukraine?
Yeah. Anybody want to take that? General Breedlove, do you want to start us off on that question?
I'm sorry, the thing blinked. Can you just say it?
It's basically, what did we miss in the Russia-Ukraine case that allowed deterrence to fail? You know, is that essentially yes?
Well, I think I mentioned it a little bit in my remarks. We started back in 2014, the first two times that Russia invaded Ukraine, when they, people like to say it wasn't an invasion of Crimea, but they occupied it and still occupy it. And when they invaded the Donbass and ensconced their puppets there, we started way back then telling the world what we would not do. We're not going to fight in Ukraine. We're not going to fight Russia. We're not putting American troops on the ground. We're not going to allow Ukraine to fire into Russia. We built our own deterrence by statement and speech. And I think that we need to be very clear and not do that in China. And in the case of China, we've already kind of begun that. And we've been doing it for some time now. When we talk about, we don't see any case where we would strike the Chinese mainland. I mean, that would be just heaven to hear that as a military commander. that your enemy says, you will not strike me, I can only strike you. And so I think we need to be careful about the things that we put out there. And I understand it's an attempt to avoid broadening or deepening or quickening a conflict. But the fact of the matter is, when we enable the enemy by telling him what we fear most, where do you think the enemy will go? And that's exactly what Mr. Putin is doing to us now.
I would add two other factors that are a little different. One is, you know, in authoritarian regimes, you often have a leader who creates a leadership climate, shall we say, that really is hostile to dissent. I don't know if any of you saw the videotape of Putin quizzing his National Security Council members. Some of them were trembling so much they could barely speak, afraid of saying something that would anger him and land them in jail or worse. And so in that environment, the risk that you overestimate your own capability because no one's going to tell you the bad news that we're not ready or we're not that capable or we have these issues, that your own worldview is not questioned or pressure, your assumptions are not pressure tested. I think that, you know, Putin overestimated his own military's capability dramatically, but he also kind of drank his own Kool-Aid about this narrative of US decline, that we're feckless, look, we're polarized, they're inept, you know, their politics are so divided, they're pulling out back from the world, you know, they've got collapsing buildings in Florida, you know, financial crisis, you know, he kind of got himself to believe that we were just not capable anymore. And I think that twin sides of the, you know, two sides of that coin is a worry in an authoritarian system in Beijing as well, that they can underestimate us and overestimate themselves. And that can also contribute to a failure of deterrence.
I guess when I look back and, you know, John and I can have a conversation about, you know, how well deterrence succeeded or not and deterring what. And so I'm confining my remarks sort of to Ukraine, deterring the incursion or grab of of Ukraine. And so when I look back, I think that for a while now, we have not appreciated the Russian way of war. Which is not a mirror image of the way we think about things. And I think that they've, for a while, been blurring the lines between peace and war, using an all-azimuth set of instruments to try to advance what they have seen to be a long-term competition. I think we have been more episodic. We have a different and I think as a result, we were not fully appreciating that sort of long-term calculus of a regime that may have been intoxicated with its own hubris and not getting great information, but reading the West's response as feckless, and that there is an asymmetry of both stakes and power in the region, such that they could make they could take an opportunistic make an opportunistic grab of Ukraine. And I think that the requirements for deterrence on our part of that type of action are very, very high, given the asymmetries of stakes at hand. That said, I think one of the things that we would want to think about in that kind of asymmetric situation is not just limiting our strategy of dealing with Russia to deterrence and making deterrence the be all and end all. That is going to clearly have an important dimension to it. But when you're dealing with the situation like we saw like we see in Russia, I think there is an element of a competitive strategy, a longer term way of thinking about things. We didn't have to win on every different plane and every different issue, but there are areas that we'd want to pick and choose and drive Russia in its ambitions to areas that were secondary to our interests. And I think having, you know, reflecting back, I think there's probably more that we could have done on a competitive strategy approach rather than relying on deterrence for this particular part of it. But I would agree with John. I think deterrence is held in other contexts and at other levels. But with respect to specifically the Ukraine context, I think there was a big tall order.
Thanks very much. I completely agree that, Putin wildly overestimated his capabilities and underestimated the, resolve and abilities of kind of the coalition facing him. I mean, this is like Sun Tzu-Bing Fa 101, know yourself, know your enemy. So the more clarity we can have, the better. I mean, like uncertainty is kind of the cause of war. But I want to highlight something that Shelley Rigger said in her keynote, right, was the importance of recognizing the agency of Taiwan and recognizing the agency of Ukraine. I totally reject the interpretation that says this is a proxy war between the United States and Russia, and the US is just pushing Ukraine into this. I think if Zelensky said tomorrow, hey, I'm ready to make a deal, I think we would probably support that, right? But right now, no, Ukraine is in it to win it, pushing, right? And as long as they're willing to do that, right, we're going to help them to do that, right? So this is an actor that has a great deal of agency in its fate, but that was not clear in February 2022, right? I don't think Zelensky knew what he had in himself and that he was going to emerge as this inspirational war leader, right? I think he was doubting his own capabilities. He was probably doubting the ability and the willingness of Ukraine to resist as much as the Russians were, right? So maybe one thing is the importance of like the state for whom, right, this conflict really matters needs to make it clear, right, that they are also in it to win it, right? And then you're going to have all the help that you need, right? The United States should not be pushing Taiwan into a war or fighting Taiwan's battles for it, right? It can't, right? I mean, this is going to be Taiwan's war. So I think as long as that's clear, that would do a tremendous amount for helping to clarify all of these sort of general issues about the balance of capabilities and resolve.
Good news is I see a lot more questions. The bad news is I've learned over time never to stand between an audience of this size and lunch. So I'm going to turn it back over to Professor, and you can tell us what happens next. But first, actually, please join me in thanking my fellow panelists.
So I hope you are well replenished for more food for thought. We are going to offer now. So our second panel, the topic is Taiwan's crucial role at the center of the US-China tech war. And I will first introduce our moderator, Dr. Alistair Yang, and then Dr. Yang will introduce the panelists for us. So Dr. Yang is a professor, the Neo Family Chair, and co-director of the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies and the Center for International Strategy, Technology, and Policy at the same Nunn School. He was previously the chair of the European Union Studies Association, and his main research interest is international political economy, directly relevant to our second panel. And he has performed consultancy work for the US and the UK government and the European Commission. And in recent years, since China has emerged as a crucial issue of the EU, Dr. Yang's research has also pivoted to Asia a little bit and has, organized several really important workshops on China. So we are really glad to have Dr. Yang to moderate the second panel for us. So Dr. Yang, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dalton, for the kind introduction and for organizing this event. Thank you to TECO for sponsoring it and working with us. Despite what Dr. Lin said, I am operating well out of area here. But luckily, we have experts who are very much in their domain. So as Director General Wang and Michelle Flournoy both pointed out this morning, Taiwan's overwhelming centrality in the production of high-end semiconductor production means that it is of central importance to the global economy. In addition, as Shelley Rigger addressed in the question and answer session after her wonderful keynote, the US's escalating technology competition with China is having significant implications for Chinese companies. So we are privileged, therefore, to have a panel of experts on East Asia and technology and industrial policy to discuss the challenges and opportunities for Taiwan amid the heightening technology competition between the United States and China. And I am honored to introduce the panelists. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. So Dr. John Krieger, who's joining us online. Hi, John. Is Kranzberg Professor Emeritus in the School of History and Sociology, the Georgia Institute of Technology. He received the 2020 Francis Bacon Award in History and Philosophy of Science and Technology for his continued and substantial impact on the history of science, technology, and a historically engaged philosophy of science. His most recent co-authored book, Knowledge, Regulation, and National Security in Post-War America, published last year by the University of Chicago Press, speaks to the US's restrictions on technology exports to China. He will provide a framework in which to understand that discussion. Dr. Fei-Ling Wang, down at the far end of the table, is my colleague in the Nunn School, a professor. His research interests are on comparative and international political economy, US-East Asia relations, and East Asia and China studies. His most recent book, just last month, The China Record, an assessment of the People's Republic, was published by SUNY Press, and it provides an assessment of the nature, strengths, weaknesses, and implications of China as an emerging superpower and a potential world leader. I believe that was a request in the first panel was to have someone talk about that, so there you go. So Fei-Ling will discuss what drives Chinese innovation and link it to China's wider ambitions. To my left is Daniel Alm, he's a professor, a PhD student in the Nunn School. He is particularly interested in the intersection of great power competition, the role of alliances, and the drivers of innovation. He previously served as the Harold Rosenthal Fellow, both with the US House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Non-Proliferation. Daniel will talk about the Fab Four coalition between the United States, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Then we'll hear from Jared McKinney, down there, who is an assistant professor in international security at the Air War College. He focuses on East Asia and Great Power Peace. He recently co-edited Chinese Regionalism in Asia, Beyond the Belt and Road Initiative, published by Routledge in 2022. Jared will zero in on Taiwan's Silicon Shield and the future of deterrence. We're linking nicely with the previous panel. And then closing us out, I'll have Jacques Delisle, who's a professor in political science and law at the University of Pennsylvania, where he also serves as director for the Center for the Study of Contemporary China and the co-director of the Center for Asian Law. He also directs the Asia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He recently co-edited Taiwan and the Area of Tsai Ing-wen, Changes and Challenges, published by Routledge in 2021. Jacques will reflect on the implications for Taiwan amid the US-China technology competition. The speakers have been asked to talk for 10 minutes each to allow time for questions and answers. And although the symposium officially ends at 3, I have been told that if you want, you can stay and carry on the conversation after that. With that, can I turn it over to you, John?
Thank you, Alistair, and thank you, Dalton, for inviting me to this important event, and good evening, everybody from Paris. In this short talk, I want to discuss the geopolitical stakes regarding Taiwan's future and that of its outstandingly successful firm TSMC, or the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. To do this, we need to move beyond a bilateral analysis of the increasing tension between two superpowers, the United States and China. We need to think globally, because if we don't think globally, we lose sight of the core geopolitical dimension of this process. TSMC is the dominant hub in a global high-tech technology industry, one major link in a technological supply chain that embraces firms and governments throughout the industrialized world. Not all are easily persuaded to renounce access to the Chinese market or to toe the confrontational line followed by the US president and by Congress. To develop my argument, let me first briefly scrutinize the industrial and technological sites that constitute this global supply chain and look at their implications for American policy. The global history of integrated circuits, or chips as we now call them, has been described in Chris Miller's bestseller, Chip Wars, that all of you have probably read. The point I want to extract from that history is TSMC's original business model. While many major advances in chip power from the 50s to the 70s took place in the United States, when it came to manufacturing chips, the center of gravity initially shifted to East Asia, where wages were lower and workers were more disciplined. This enabled companies like Sharp and Sony in Japan and Samsung in South Korea to persuade US firms to manufacture chips in their countries. In 1968, the Taiwanese government invited Texas Instruments to do the same. They lured Morris Chang, a top TI manager and Harvard graduate who was born in China in 1931, back to Taiwan and told him to develop a world-class chip industry. Chang took on the challenge and founded TSMC, today the global champion in the manufacture of advanced microchips. Chang's success lay in taking seriously Moore's famous law that the power of chips would double every 2 years. Why then, if that is the case, invest in a product that can take $500 million to develop, when you can be overtaken in a few years by a rival firm? Chang chose to concentrate resources on the last step in the chain, building a manufacturing facility or fab that took advantage of the next incremental improvement in speed and power to dominate the production of advanced chips at a level where no one else could easily compete with him. This gave him ready access to the demand for chips at the high end of the civil and military markets. He's been joined later, subsequently, by firms like Samsung and Nikon and Intel. So-called commodity chips, chips in your smartphone or in your toothbrush, are left to companies who design and manufacturing them for everyday use. So we distinguish between commodity chips and high-end chips. The other crucial player in this market is the Dutch firm ASML, Advanced Semiconductor Manufacturing Materials Lithography. ASML is among the first in the world to develop a technique called EUV, Extreme Ultraviolet Lithography, to make high-end chips. These manufacturing devices cost $160 million each, probably the most expensive mass-produced machine tool in history. It uses extreme ultraviolet light to etch transistors as small as 5 nanometers or 5 times 10 to the 9 meters onto a silicon base, and has plans to reduce the size to 3 nanometers. TSMC in Taiwan cannot manufacture very high-end chips without machine tools using EUV, like those manufactured by ASML and some other firms. Why does this matter? China is the biggest market for chips in the world. 95% of the chips it uses in emerging technologies like AI, for example, are imported. And it is here that Biden's novelty comes in. Biden does not simply want to deny export licenses to firms that want to continue to market their semiconductor design and manufacturing technology in China. His CHIP Act of October 22 has gone much further than that. In the words of Greg Allen of the Washington-based think tank CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies, the US president favors, I quote, an unprecedented degree of US government intervention in the supply chain system to control the global supply chain and to begin a new US policy of actively strangling large segments of the Chinese technology industry, strangling with the intent to kill, as Allen puts it. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan recently emphasized that the US needed a new approach to export controls, particularly on foundational technologies such as advanced logic and memory chips. For those kinds of technologies, Sullivan said, we must move away from our previous approach of maintaining relative advantage over competitors. That meant 1 or 2 generations ahead of our competitors, and instead seek to maintain as large a lead as possible. We must open the technological gap as far as possible with China. There are 3 things to note about Biden's new regulatory system. First, it restricts exports to China by US firms like NVIDIA and AMD, so in-house national firms like NVIDIA and AMD, who are leading chip designers that have supplied high-end chips to China for AI and for supercomputing. And I should say that when he announced his policy, the shares of these companies on the American stock market collapsed because of the loss of market that it entailed. Secondly, and that's unusual about it, it targets individual American citizens and green card holders who work in China or who work for firms anywhere in the world that supply chips manufacturing equipment to Chinese clients. They are no longer allowed to share their US origin knowledge, know-how, and experience with their colleagues at the manufacturing facilities abroad. As one of them put it, you either give up your citizenship or you quit your job in China. So that's a hard choice for some of them. Thirdly, and this is my key point probably, these tighter regulations apply extraterritorially. What that means is that is that they apply to foreign firms trading with China in chip manufacturing systems that include US hardware or US origin technical data, which means knowledge and know-how. This is explicitly confirmed in a new foreign direct product rule promulgated by the Department of Commerce that stipulates that US license restrictions also apply to foreign firms that use components made in the USA to produce high-end chips for any dual-use applications in China. In short, the Biden administration has not simply devised policies that restrict the sale of high-end chip material of any kind to China by firms that fall directly under American jurisdiction. It has constructed a global export control regime whose tentacles reach into the heart of the whole semiconductor manufacturing system in other technologically advanced countries, diluting their national economic and industrial sovereignty. For this techno-nationalist agenda to succeed, it requires widespread multilateral support by allied governments and businesses alike. And that's why we're facing a global problem. Is he getting that support? By and large, the answer to date is yes, but not without considerable resentment in some countries. Let me just run through a few countries, a few examples, beginning with Taiwan. To ensure access to TSMC's manufacturing capacity, particularly if China should take control of the country, by the way, Biden persuaded Morris Chang, the founder of TSMC, to build a facility in the US. Chang accepted the subsidies, but reluctantly. TSMC had built its success using a cheap and motivated labor force. Things are different in the US, as Chang said explicitly in a global forum in Singapore a few months ago. Because machines like those made by ASML are so expensive, they need to be running 24 hours a day to justify their cost. I quote, "If it breaks down at 1 a.m. in the morning in the US, it will be fixed the next morning. But in Taiwan, it will be fixed at 2 a.m. And this refers back to Shelley's point about high HVAC support inside Taiwan, where people are constantly present to maintain the temperature inside the manufacturing systems on a 7/24 basis. That is not going to be possible in the United States. Chang therefore expected manufacturing costs of these chips in America to be far higher in the United States as in Asian countries, and feared that these chips would be completely priced out of the market. How about ASML? The Dutch have also been cooperative, but only up to a point. On the 8th of March this year, the Dutch government announced that after consultation with the US and Japan, I'll get back to that in a minute, was imposing restrictions on the export of advanced chip manufacturing equipment. As the Dutch Minister of Commerce put it, taking account of technological developments and the geopolitical context, we've decided that it is necessary for international security to extend existing controls on the export of specific equipment used for the manufacture of the most advanced semiconductors by our companies like ASML. This was a significant new step since ASML had already stopped selling its most advanced EUV equipment to China in 2019. It was now being asked to refuse to sell even the less performing version to the PRC. The CEO, as you can imagine, was not particularly happy, although he went along with his government's point of view, pointing out that sales to China accounted for no less than 18% of his profits. The Japanese government soon followed suit. Under US pressure, so as not to gain access to a market that the Dutch had agreed to withdraw from. And that's, of course, the problem. If one country refuses to withdraw, others can fill the vacuum or the gap if you don't persuade their governments to fall in line. Anyway, on the 31st of March 2023, so that's just a couple of weeks ago, the Japanese government announced that it was adding 23 new items to its list of commodities subject to export controls. The 23 items include products related to manufacturing equipment for extreme EUV lithography. 10 firms, including Nikon, are expected to be affected and to have their profit margins affected. To conclude, Biden's new techno-nationalist policies pose a major threat to China's long-term economic and military ambitions that depend heavily on the availability of high-end chips to power emerging dual-use technologies. To succeed, the president requires allied governments and firms to accept the extraterritorial application of US export controls, and the associated dilution of sovereignty entails and the loss of profits for their firms. They cannot always be accounted upon to do so, if only because, as one economic advisor to the Australian government put it many years ago, and I quote here, "There is a tendency in Washington to desire to work out American solutions to world problems and expect other countries to accept these without much demur, an attitude that some people in high places," he said, "could regard as American interference or even American imperialism." So far, Biden seems to be achieving his goals. At least most of the countries he's approached have fallen in line. It's anybody's guess what will happen if he's replaced in the White House by Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis in 2025. Thank you.
Great, John. Thank you very much for getting us started. Now turn it over to Fei-Ling.
All right. Thank you, Alistair. Thank you, Dalton, for organizing this, and welcome to Georgia Tech. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to share with you some of my ideas on the US-China competition and also the role of technology and the role of Taiwan. It seems to me that an overall and global rivalry between the United States and People's Republic of China is on the way. And more than likely, in my opinion, we're already in the so-called new Cold War. No, it's a dreaded kind of situation, new Cold War again. But I think, in my opinion, actually, Cold War-like confrontation probably is the most likely and the least bad situation between two countries if you can keep it cold, right? So a lot of things can be done to keep it as cold as possible. In my opinion, the US-China rivalry is truly an existential struggle for the CCP regime, but not necessarily for the Chinese nation or for the Chinese people. And that's a critical distinction that can allow us to do a lot in trying to keep this competition cold. But for the United States, I also submit for you to consider it is also kind of existential to some extent, mostly the American way of life, the American leadership in the world and the international community, and the Western leadership in the world is in danger of survival. That's kind of an existential kind of a struggle. It also, in my opinion, the result of this competition will shape the future of world order. So we have a choice basically to make. Shall we continue the kind of liberal iteration of the Westphalian world order, or are we going to do something about the world in the general direction of organizing the world more or less like the world empire that we call the China order in the past, that has actually ruled singularly the whole known world in eastern part of the Eurasian continent for centuries in the past, right? That's a viable possibility, and that actually is, in my opinion, in the back of the mind of Chinese leaders for generations, not just Xi Jinping. So that's a key to the competition between US and China, which is global, existential, and comprehensive, is actually who is going to have the upper hand in technology capabilities. So the so-called tech war between US and China. This is basically kind of talking about, in my opinion, two things, I think. One is the innovation itself, like new ideas, new concepts, and so on. And the other is application of ideas, the engineering part of it. This is where I would think Taiwan occupies a critical position, a critical point in this US-China global competition, because Taiwan performed two important roles for the power competition between US and China. In a sense, Taiwan is offering original ideas, original ways of doing things, and cutting-edge products, like by great firms like TSMC. We talked about this already, and John, talked about the details of that already. I also think that Taiwan has a unique role in the application technology, represented by companies like Foxconn. All the companies, they actually brought Western know-how and a Western way of doing things, combined with the Chinese sense of organizing things, and also with a strong sense of Chinese culture to make it work in the China context. So Taiwan, for the past 30, 40 years, in my opinion, has been instrumental to the rise of Chinese economy, especially the Chinese exports of manufactured goods. So Taiwan occupies a critical position, not just having new technology, but also how to use it. And also Taiwan occupies an important position in terms of global supply chains, like a big link over there, right? Like it or not. So that's critical for both United States and China. Well, just like the United States, the PRC is fully aware of the importance of technology. In fact, from Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping, every PRC leader knew that material power and technology are the key things to win the competition. Despite their rhetoric about how great their system is and how wonderful Mao Zedong thought, Xi Jinping thoughts are, but they actually are worshippers of raw power and technology. So PRC has been pouring lots of resources into R&D, as you can imagine, right? For over the years. We have actually tremendously impressive numbers about infrastructure built in China, for example, institutes, think tanks, laboratories, and so on. We also have a great number of STEM students graduated in China, outnumbering the United States by a bigger margin, increasingly bigger margin, right? We also have scientific papers published in China, and the numbers of scientific papers published in China really is leaping up, almost like shooting a satellite into the air. Very high, very steep increase. We also have patents registered. The Chinese now outnumber any other country, including the United States, in terms of new patents registered, right? Those are all critically important. I think that you all know the drive behind the Chinese effort to innovate is deeply rooted in actually the CCP's sense of insecurity. It's for regime survival, to protect regime. It is also, in my opinion, related to a very strong and growing hunger for more power, more control. Because if we rely on material power to rule, to govern, the tricky thing is you actually become insatiable in terms of how much power you want. When country you want to build until the end, you control everything, everybody under the sun. That's called Tianxia system, the China order, right? That is, of course, the holy grail. Before then, China is going to spend as much as it can to invest. My colleague here, my fellow panelists here, Dan, On, and I are called to the piece. We try to flush out the two drives for survival, insecurity, and for more power. For ambition, right? I will, of course, leave Dan, who is actually the lead author, to talk about this later, right? So I'm going to just skip that, except for saying that we think the Chinese effort in capturing the technological high ground is deeply, deeply structurally based. It's not something that Xi Jinping or anybody will change that personally, until, of course, the regime is transformed, or PRC managed to control the whole world to subjugate mighty American power on its wings, right? That's kind of the end result. All right. So the dream, the China dream of overpowering or replacing the United States whenever or wherever possible is constant, hasn't changed, right? Again, until the DNA of the regime is changed, right? So therefore, Taiwan has rightfully been viewed by many in China as critical, just in terms of its utility in technology, right? More than one Chinese senior officials and analysts have openly declared, the most recent one actually just a few days ago, last weekend, openly saying we shall take TSMC by force, and we will be beating the United States and the Dutch, in terms of chip making, right? Which is kind of a reasonable assertion to make, right? So therefore, by that kind of thinking, by controlling Taiwan physically, hopefully, or other ways, will allow China to have an upper hand in defeating the so-called hostile forces, including the United States, and of course, the little brother, Japan. But unlike United States, I was submitted for to consider the PRC gigantic investing of R&D has been characteristically cost ineffective. The lack of innovation, for example, and also the kind of a cursed situation where PRC has to emulate others, to sort of follow others, is what I submitted for you to consider is a systemic and structural. It's in the DNA of the system. As long as systems are transformed, PRC is going to be stuck as an imitator and or copycat, if you will, right? I mean, that's kind of unfortunate for them. Even though they spend a lot of money, those patent papers, if you analyze them closely, they are usually kind of ineffectual and useless, And finally, very quickly, I think the burning desire for regime survival and for competing and replacing the United States will propel the PRC to do more in terms of Taiwan, as long as Taiwan remains kind of a critical player in both innovation and application technology. So therefore, any effective effort to constrain the PRC power, the so-called partial decoupling based on Western terms, well, will not do well without taking Taiwan into full consideration. Taiwan has to be part of the whole equation. And therefore, any further kind of effort to address the competition between US and China effectively will have to emphasize on more cooperation between Taiwan and the United States, chips and others, and also to make sure that the Taiwanese asset will not be seized easily. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Pei Ling. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Young, and thank you to Dr. Lin and TECO for organizing this timely event. So I'm delighted to be here. And this morning, Dr. Rickers and Director General Wang highlighted for you quite persuasively, I'd say, why Taiwan matters. And then Dr. Krieg built on that foundation to explain more specifically how Taiwan's semiconductor industry has evolved over the years. So let me just hone in on a few key points to build on that foundation. So the first is a contextual point about the global semiconductor supply chain. The first thing to know about this global semiconductor supply chain is that it's actually not quite so global. Yes, all the steps necessary to create a chip are dispersed across the world, but the highest value, least replaceable segments of the semiconductor supply chain are concentrated in the hands of a few countries and sometimes a single company. So US firms, for example, they dominate the design stage, which generates the most revenue. Companies in the US and Japan, they lead the industry in providing and sourcing the tools and chemicals needed to build the machines that eventually build the chips. But there's a particular machine that Professor Krieg already mentioned that is needed to create the most advanced chips. And it's these extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, basically that shine light through a mask, through chemicals to imprint the most advanced designs onto a silicon wafer. That machine is built only in one country and only by one company, the ASML. Then there are the actual manufacturers of the chips. So companies like Intel, Texas Instruments, yes, they produce chips, but only 2 companies in the world produce the most advanced chips. That's TSMC in Taiwan, as we've mentioned, and Samsung in South Korea. So the rest of the steps, yes, collection of raw materials, assembly, testing, packaging, they're more dispersed, but they account for a far smaller portion of the global market share. So all told, if you take the highest portions of the market share in design, lithography, machine manufacturing, and fabrication, you'll notice 2 things. One, that they account for 92% of the global value chain. And 2, they belong to the hands of the US and its close partners and allies. So that's US, EU, primarily in the Netherlands, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. This naturally raises the question, what's China's overall share? 6%. 6%. So, and virtually everything that they do in the chips industry is replaceable, and it tends to be on the lower end of the value chain. So this is why, in many ways, the current semiconductor supply chain is less like a global network and more of a private club of close US friends and allies. And this is why they're eager right now to leverage those advantages to try to shape the future of the industry. As a corollary, this is also why there's a lot of heartburn in Beijing and why they're trying to break out of foreign dependence on chips. And Taiwan seems to sit at the center of this US-China competition, as others have highlighted. So second point. So a number of people have mentioned that Taiwan produces 90% of the most advanced chips, and that's true. But let me unpack that a little bit, because it's not just about global market share. It's also about how they've positioned themselves to be indispensable in the global supply chain. So I think that's an agreement. So Taiwan's leading chip from TSMC, as we've mentioned, is a foundry. What that basically means is they don't provide end-to-end service. They don't design their own chips. They don't build their own chips. Virtually, they focus all their efforts on building everybody else's chips. And this is by design, so that TSMC doesn't compete with major US tech firms. Apple, Google, Amazon, they don't compete with them. They're actually clients. They all reach out, they all buy chips from TSMC. Who else are TSMC clients? The US military industrial complex. So many defense systems, as has been mentioned before, fighter jet satellites, missile defense systems, and so forth, rely on still commercial chips sourced from Taiwan. Clients also include, of course, firms in China, Japan, South Korea, and all over the world. So in addition to producing 90% of the cutting edge chips, if you look at the full spectrum, TSMC produces 22% of all chips and 37% of the world's logic chips. That basically are that provide the processing speed. So if you compare that to Saudi Arabia's 12% of global oil production, it's quite impressive. And it also challenges or stands impressive against OPEC's 40% of global market share. So in the catastrophic case, if Taiwan's production capabilities were to be halted, somehow interrupted, more than a third of the world's new computing power would be wiped out. Efforts to develop new emerging technologies, such as an AI or 5G, which rely on these cutting edge chips, they grind to a halt. A recent report commissioned by the State Department estimated that if China were to blockade Taiwan, and we're not even talking about invasion at this point, just a blockade, the price tag on the intervention would be to the tune of around $2 trillion right now, which is around 4 times the value of the entire semiconductor industry's annual global sales. So third point, the current risks and some comparative strengths that Taiwan has. So in many ways, it's Taiwan's value to the global semiconductor supply chain that also makes it a ripe target for coercion. TSMC is often the target of hacks to extract vital intellectual property. They're also a destined or desired source for poaching the top talent for many companies in order to replicate TSMC's success elsewhere, but which we haven't really seen mature. There's also the market threat. As others have highlighted, policymakers are growing uneasy about relying so much for the most advanced chips on a single company. But they're also simply firms that are always trying to increase their market share, companies that are trying to improve their position in the supply chain. So China's been mentioned briefly. Just to briefly add, 6% lowest into the value chain at this point, as people probably know. They spend more money on importing chips than they do oil. In 2020, it was actually twice the amount. So chips are important, and China's trying to build its indigenous capabilities. The second, the US is also trying to reestablish manufacturing capabilities at home. As Dr. Riggers mentioned earlier, the CHIPS Act is not for Taiwan, but because the economic incentives and the tax incentives are so powerful, TSMC can't help but resist in investing some of its manufacturing capability in the US. And third, US export controls were already touched, so I'll just briefly say that among TSMC's customers, Chinese firms were the second largest customer. So Taiwan now has to navigate how to maintain some of its production facilities in China, continue to sell to China, while also maintaining strong diplomatic and economic ties with the US. That said, Taiwan's position in the semiconductor industry also affords it tremendous comparative advantages in shaping the future of the industry. In many ways, Taiwan's chip industry has been able to engage in commercial diplomacy in ways that have been otherwise closed through direct diplomatic channels. For instance, Taiwan is a member of the WTO and APEC, but it's not a member of the regional trade agreements in Asia. So the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, CPTPP, it's not, though it's applied to be a member to the last one. That said, TSMC, simply by being a leading fabrication firm, has been able to coordinate across all the different sectors of the market and set standards without actually raising this to a state-to-state agreement. This is not to say, of course, that Taiwan is not engaged in a number of regional and bilateral dialogues. The US and Taiwan have a number of venues to discuss economic relations, including in chips. So when we specifically think about the Chip 4 Alliance, Taiwan's position is crucial there. And if you look at the global market value of Taiwan, US, ROK, and Japan, together they compose 81% of the global market share. And they had their first meeting last February, and this is something that will continue to evolve. Now, there's an important caveat to make about the Chip 4 Alliance, though, because while at a national level, there's great sense of complementarity. At the firm level, they're all inherently competitive. Right? Because in theory, the idea of combining the relative strengths of each segment in the supply chain, it sounds ideal, but together they could coordinate to avoid duplication, they could double down on strengths and create more resilient supply chains. But at the firm level, all of this information that they might potentially share could be considered trade secrets. So, we see that firms across countries may be concerned about sharing these trade secrets. When the Biden administration asked US companies to share information to their own US government, they are reluctant. So these companies hold these trade secrets quite closely. That said, there are a number of reasons to be optimistic. These countries share deep democratic values, share the vision of a liberal rules-based order, and they do a great deal of trading with each other. So for instance, Taiwan is South Korea's top 10, in the top 10 of export markets. Guess what they sell? Semiconductors. In addition, there's a lot of bottom-up industry coordination. So for instance, recently, the big semiconductor companies, including Intel, TSMC, Samsung, for example, agreed to set standards for chip stacking. What that means basically is up until the last decade, we improved processing power by simply making the transistors smaller and fitting more into the chips. But as basically we start to approach the atomic level and we can't make them any smaller, we just started to stack, we as in the actual experts, not me, started to stack them on top of each other. But because those are so complex, in order to make them interoperable, these companies gathered together to start to set agreed upon standards. The last of many advantages is just accumulated know-how over 35 years. So, because it's not just about the technology, right? It's about the culture, the practice, the training, the engineering talent. So for instance, even if China were to receive the most advanced fabrication machines today, they'd still be years behind because they don't have the engineers who have tested, who have failed, who have calibrated, who have perfected the process system over many years. So in many ways, these factors will help TSMC maintain its industry lead in the long run. So I'll stop there.
And thank you very much. All right, and now carrying on, we have Jared.
Excellent. This is really a good introduction to what I hope to talk about. So lots of good context here. Before I proceed, I just need to comment that these opinions are my own and I'm not representing anyone here today. So I want to answer 3 questions in my comments. The first question is, does the silicon shield still exist? The second question I want to look at is, we've had an overview of the export controls, but looking this decade, what is the likely impact of the export controls on China? And then the third question I want to answer is, how does technological rivalry influence deterrence and decisions for war and peace this decade? So I'll go down those. First, does the silicon shield still exist? The answer is, there's actually been different silicon shields, and we're sort of deceiving ourselves if we use this term in a sort of singular manner. The first stage of the silicon shield was what I call a commitment device. It, like Kuwait's oil, imposed constraints on China. The constraint, I think, was always weak on its own because the United States was Taiwan's friends for other reasons. This is before deep interdependence grew between China and Taiwan. But as it did in the 2000s and 2010s, I think the second stage of the silicon shield was as an interdependence device. Growing interdependence and positive trade expectations between the PRC and Taiwan incentivized restraint. Restraint made sense because a rising tide lifted all boats, including that of the PRC. Stage 3, I think, is now, and we're seeing a reversal of the silicon shield as a commitment device as the semiconductor industry diversifies outside of Taiwan, including in the United States and especially in South Korea. And we're also seeing a reversal of the silicon shield as an interdependence device. And TSMC's sales to China as a percentage of annual revenue have fallen from 20% in 2018 to 10% today, according to TSMC annual reports. This number probably will continue to fall overall because as a result of US export controls that began not in the current form, but began in the Trump administration as controls on ZTE and Huawei. So the bottom line is that the silicon shield, I think, will cease to exist in either of the prior forms. And a third form may emerge, which might be called the silicon magnet. And Fei-Ling Wang, I think, referred to this, which is the idea that there's tremendous amounts of technology and value just across the Taiwan Strait that the PRC no longer has access to, at least to a great extent as before, and no longer has positive expectations about accessing in the future. So point 2, what is going to be the effect of US export controls long term? This is actually a very hard question to answer, and this is my honest best guess. China will adapt for lagging edge products, but without access to Western technologies and EUV machinery in particular, it will be cut off from the emerging fourth industrial revolution in the short to medium term. Samsung says it's launching a 2-nanometer node in 2025. TSMC says it's launching 2 nanometers in 2026. Intel claims it's going to launch 1.8 nanometers in 2025. By 2030 or thereabouts, China will likely still be stuck at 12 nanometers for commercially viable production. And that assumes that no additional export controls are imposed on China between now and then. But I don't know if it'd be worth betting money on that assumption. If that is the case, by 2030, China would be 2 times behind in speed and efficiency for CPUs, assuming conservative rates of progress, which I calculate at approximately 15% per node. For GPUs, graphics processing units, the difference in 2030 would be exponential. And you can already see this. So right now, NVIDIA's new H100 chip, which they've just introduced to replace the A100 chip that things like ChatGPT was trained on, is, according to calculations, 3 times more powerful. The H100 chip is fabricated on a TSMC 4 nanometer node, while the A100 chip was fabricated on a TSMC 7 nanometer node. The A100 chip is itself already banned for export to China as a part of the export controls. So we've already seen a potential 3 times difference in GPU computing power that's emerged within the first year of the export controls. And my prediction for the future is that this will continue to happen in the 2030s, and that by the end of the decade, even though China will have made up for lagging edge products, probably up to 12 nanometers, beyond that, it'll be stuck. And therefore, China's plan for innovation-driven development will actually fail. I don't know if they've recognized this yet or not, but that's my read of the situation. And then finally, how does technological rivalry influence deterrence and decision-making this decade? Thucydides said that there were 3 chief motivations for human decision-making. These are fear, honor, and interest. And I think we can do a quick fear, honor, and interest breakdown of potential PRC decision-making. On the fear front, I think that the PRC genuinely fears the disappearance of the established sort of one China framework. China helped destroy this framework by showing that one country, 2 systems was not sustainable in Hong Kong. At the same time, China's grand strategy for peaceful unification with Taiwan has increasingly failed. It was an engagement strategy. Trade and deepening interconnections were supposed to produce alignment. That has not in fact happened, even though that was the assumption from Deng to Xi. At the same time, since 2016, many aspects of the one China policy arrangement in Taiwan and the United States, I think we can say, have decayed. And I've counted more than 20 firsts, things that haven't happened since 1979, that have happened since 2016. And these vary from President-elect Trump speaking with Zhang Wen on the phone, and people like former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo or former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper calling for the abolition of the one China policy. So I don't think we're in a stable equilibrium on the one China question. And given elections in Taiwan and the United States in 2024, I think there's going to be lots of potential opportunities for crises and sort of reactive fear in China. At the same time, on the question of honor, the CCP, for various reasons I think that others have alluded to, has set a sort of 2049 objective for unification with China. And this is clearly articulated in all of the main party documents now, including at the most recent party Congress. So there have been calls for PLA readiness by 2027, and this has contributed to a feeling of increased danger, even though the timeline itself seems to remain 2049 as a sort of endpoint. As Chinese economic growth slows this decade, and as innovation-driven development fails as a grand economic strategy, I think the CCP is going to feel increasing pressure to legitimate itself through nationalism, which will require tough responses to perceived provocations. Given increasing PLA readiness, this may create expectations for action sooner than 2049. And then finally, on the interest point, interest is probably the weakest of all of the human motivations for war, with fear and honor being more important. Even so, in this particular case, I do think it's important, and Taiwan's so-called or former Silicon Shield plays into this. I think it's imaginable that she could stare across the channel and feel the attraction of Taiwan's silicon genius, as Saddam once stared at Kuwait's gold and oil. I think people dismiss this view for three reasons. One, because they don't see evidence of it, but as Fei Ling pointed out, increasingly, there is actually evidence for it in China. Secondly, because I think people want to boil down human motivations to this or that. But I think it's okay, actually, to see motivations, some in the fear spectrum, some in the honor, and some in the interest spectrum. And then finally, I think people underestimate how greatly the PRC is going to be affected by being shut out of the current generation of silicon technology. China has 0 or perhaps 1 EUV machine, and across the strait, of the approximate 100 in existence today, maybe 50 or 60 are in Taiwan. I think it's not unreasonable to say that the PRC could see these 50 or 60 machines as holding the key to beating the middle income trap and intelligentizing the PLA armed forces. The idea, in my view, that if the PRC had EUV machines and wouldn't be able to use them is a very silly idea. I think that's like saying, even if we sold F-35s to the PRC, they couldn't figure out how to maintain them. This is an appropriate comparison, I think, because there's approximately 200,000 parts in an F-35, and there's approximately 200,000 parts in an EUV machine. They're some of the most complex products ever made by people. At the same time, so they represent extreme complexity, but the more important point is when you have a big incentive to learn, I think you would. So the bottom line is that fear, honor, and interest may all this decade point with increasing strength to the PRC crossing the strait. And I think that's why the situation is actually more dangerous than most people realize.
Guess I'm up next. All right. Well, thanks. One of the joys of being the last person on 2 panels is almost everything has been said, but that's never stopped anybody like me, which is to say a professor, from talking, right? Anything worth saying is worth saying at least twice. All right, I'm not that deep in the tech space, so I will defer to many of my colleagues on that, but let me just try to frame some of this a little bit. Taiwan has in many ways been one of the world's greatest beneficiaries of globalization. That is the global economic integration that took off in the 90s and persisted into the middle 2010s, but is now unraveling. Taiwan was also one of the great beneficiaries of a good period in US-China relations. Yes, there were bumps in 1989 after Tiananmen and in the third cross-straits crisis in 95, 96. But for a good number of decades, US-China relations were pretty good, and that helped open the door for Taiwan and the mainland to become more economically integrated. Many of the effects we all know over this long period: greater prosperity in Taiwan, the rise of Taiwan as a high-tech power that drew upon and contributed to US and Western technological advancements, climbing the ladder, and that allowed Taiwan to draw on the relatively low cost and high quality manufacturing available in the mainland, or to sell to mainland companies who were selling either the Chinese markets or in earlier days, primarily export markets. And you all know the story, right? You get TSMC and others as key players in a deeply integrated global supply chain for technology, albeit with key nodes, including Taiwan, and making a huge share of the world's low-end and high-end semiconductors. Taiwan companies, including through production facilities on the mainland, make lots of the consumer electronics that we all live with and use, and Taiwan became a significant innovation hub in its own right. Problem is that era seems to be coming to an end. Both of those phenomena, economic openness and positive US-China relations, have waned badly, especially over the past decade and a half, and accelerating particularly since the middle 2010s as US-China competition and rivalry has risen across just about any field you can name. The effects are many and far-reaching, pretty much around the world and for everybody, but they're especially acute and they're distinctive for Taiwan. It's obviously a big stake for a country where 50% plus of the world's chips are produced, where TSMC is the key fab for basically all the names in the business, Apple, Qualcomm, NVIDIA, AMD, and so on. And as you've heard, TSMC producing 90% plus of the most advanced chips, Taiwanese producers producing 50% or more of China's chip demands. Companies like Foxconn, your iPhone was put together at least somewhere on the mainland, although there's been some shifting of production. And again, these are the nodes, the visible points in a deeply integrated tech and ICT chain, global innovation, supply, production, marketing. At some point in that chain, it runs through Taiwan and links China, the US, and others. And it's even more complex than that usual story tells. As you've heard from my colleagues on the panel, there's a European component, a Japanese component, the Dutch are big in this, and so on. But I want to just take a step back from that in the time I've got left here and sort of frame it a bit. Which is really what's going on here is this is one piece of the securitization of economic issues. We see for some time now, the US and others talking about economic security is national security. We developed the phrase national economic security not all that long ago. And there's been growing concern, sharpening, going up almost parabolically in recent years, about the use of economic leverage to political ends, the vulnerability politically that comes with economic dependence. Taiwan knows that in the cross-strait context, and it's gotten sharper. The US and others in the global north know it in the China context. Europe now is starting to realize it in the China context after having gotten slapped upside the head about the Russian aspect of it. And before that, before the Ukraine war, even we saw it coming up in things like COVID, the dependence for certain key inputs for public health being sourced in a handful of places, including primarily China. And we've seen the tech changes be part of this story as well. Not too many years ago, you could disentangle military technology from economic technology. Now everything's dual use, either directly or will in some way contribute to the military capacity of a potentially rivalrous state. And there's the concern not only that US dual use or military capability enhancing technology will make its way to China, either through trade or through industrial espionage, but also that importing Chinese-made technology into the US poses its own risks. Huawei and the 5G system, TikTok and all the data vacuuming that can someday lead to the kinds of problems that lead to some rather histrionic hearings on Capitol Hill, but they're not entirely without some connection to reality. So a little bit about what we've seen in the responses to this, which my colleagues on the panel have gotten into some. A big part of this is the legal and regulatory restrictions in terms of sensitive tech on the US side. The so-called tech and trade war, of course, started under Trump with national security-based restrictions on the sales of key chips to Chinese companies. What we briefly talked about is a death penalty for ZTE and Huawei, although stay of execution, at least for ZTE, although not for Huawei's 5G business. We also saw 2018 amendments to the Export Control Act to make it easier to restrict exports. And then there's some good old-fashioned things like the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, the Trade Act, Section 232 and Section 301 for unfair competition and intellectual property abuse under Special 301. All these tools are out there, but the big one has been what we've seen happen with the entities list and the foreign direct products rule, which, to spare you all the sort of legal niceties, some of which we've already heard about, basically prohibits a wide range of actors: US firms, US people, including both citizens and green card holders, US capital investors, those who use US technology, either software or hardware. They are forbidden, absent licenses, to design, to export that technology, allow it to be used in China without a license from the US the Commerce Department's Bureau of International Security. And those bans, as was noted earlier, reach extraterritorially. They hit the big players in this space in Europe, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. This is a pretty big extraterritorial reach. Not by any means the first time the US has engaged in rather robust extraterritorial reach for economic regulation, but it's particularly pointed and for China at the moment, a painful one. Indeed, China has filed complaints at the World Trade Organization about what the US has been doing here. And it dovetails with other US tools. We do it on the investment side. CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US, has been very skeptical of Chinese investments in anything high-tech adjacent and much else as well. And we see that the Foreign Investment Review Modernization Act, which toughened that as well. Now, China sees this, and not entirely without reason, as part of a broader US effort to keep China down technologically, to keep it down in a sector that it considers as absolutely vital for its future power, wealth, and progress, a sort of neo-containment agenda as it's often portrayed on the Chinese side. So it's not too surprising we're hearing rumblings of retaliation. Tit for tat is a good old strategy. So we see Micron now being investigated for national cybersecurity review. We see rumblings about renewed restrictions on rare earths exports, which are a huge component to the tech industry. And we see talk about prohibiting the use of some lower end US IP-based chips for which other substitutes can be found in Chinese manufacturing plants. But that's only part of the story. It fits into a wider attempt to mitigate supply chain risk. Again, this responds to the risk from China that the political uses of economic leverage, but it also responds to things that aren't just about weaponizing economic interdependence. It's risks from climate change, from COVID, from local political unrest, anything that can disrupt supply chains. There's a sense that minimizing costs has led to some ignoring of risks. And so maybe there are other reasons feeding in and dovetailing with these national economic security based things. So we see the efforts at onshoring or friendshoring. This policy is tough to do in the US, tough to achieve economically. We've heard about the reasons for why TSMC's plant in Arizona is more a little bit like, you got a nice company here. It'd be a shame if anything happens to it. You want to open something in Arizona? I mean, it is essentially a protection payment, as my bad mafia accent tried to convey. And it's problematic for Taiwan, especially because friend shoring into Taiwan, it's not really friend shoring, it's safe shoring. And the concern is that Taiwan is friendly, but is not a safe place to move this. So Taiwan's vulnerability here is, of course, huge. And China, once again, is engaging in an imitation being the sincerest form of flattery. So we see dual circulation. We see attempts to engage in technological self-reliance and so on. This is really going to be tough for reasons you've already heard about. And so we're seeing now the third strand in this is industrial policy. China has always done it on steroids, huge investments in STEM training, in R&D, and with all the weaknesses that were just pointed out to you by my colleague to my left here, but it's still going on there and is clearly a high priority goal. And we've seen it reiterated at the 20th Party Congress, the 14th National Party Congress, and so on. The US, of course, has responded with the CHIPS and Science Act and much else, which has subsidized TSMC in the US and so on. But the question is, can the US do industrial policy? And can it do it to scale? Reasons to be skeptical about that. So I'll close by saying, what does this mean for Taiwan, which was kind of our initial mandate here to some degree. A Silicon Shield, the idea that it's a temptation for China to come and grab it. I think the grab would be really difficult. The odds that it would be physically destroyed or that the human capital would flee, or at the very least that the know-how and the IP that is key to this would fall easily into China's hands and then be usable by a China post-conflict, given the way the world would be regarding China, is pretty low. The deterrence argument, I think it's fair to say, is fading. That is, China has already started to bear the cost of exclusion from the TSMC-centered world, and so that sort of removes that element of it. The last thing I'll say, though, is that the issue is more what happens farther down the road. I don't think we're at imminent risk of war, although the risk is higher than it used to be. The fading of the Silicon Shield, at least in its current form, is one, but only one piece of that. But instead, the question is the other side, to some degree, of whether the US can, quote, keep China down as China sees it. Will China's huge investments pay off to some degree? I'm a little less skeptical than you are, but I think the jury is still very much out. And I think a bigger concern is essentially the erosion of what has for now been very robust unity in the global north. The Dutch and the Japanese and others are already grumbling about the restrictions that we've put on technology that is US linked extraterritorially. And there are complaints that US firms get favorable treatment. So what can Taiwan do about this? Well, it has limited agency. It can't really control this world that is buffeting it from both sides. What it can do is try to keep the foundations for its economic importance in place as best it can through its own industrial policy, its own restrictions on technology crossing the strait and on China acquiring stakes in Taiwan. It can make the case for limiting the harm to economic openness that's come with this new wave of national economic security-driven protectionism. Morris Chang has been quite articulate on this. And it can try to keep the US in its corner partly by the protection racket of setting up a factory in Arizona, but also playing trust and values issues, also steering clear of actions that will provoke a cross-strait crisis that the US would deem to be Taiwan's rather than China's fault. That gets tricky in an election year. They've got one coming up in January. Our season is so long, it will almost overlap. And I worry about what that will lead to in terms of some irresponsible campaigning on all sides that could make matters worse. Sorry.
Great, thank you very much. I had been busily preparing some closing remarks, but being the last person on the last panel meant that Jacques stole my thunder. So at least I'll claim that, because then you think I was that insightful. So I'm going to open the floor up to questions. We have half an hour in the legitimate time, and we are allowed to go into extra time, and I'll keep the clock on that. We have lots of questions over here.
Hey, so I know there was already some discussion of the CHIPS Act and its kind of implications moving forward, but I was wondering, because this panel is so focused on technology and, you know, obviously CHIPS Act is so focused on semiconductors, I was wondering how all of the panelists here kind of view it and how it's going to affect things moving forward, whether it's relations, whether it's kind of technological development here in the US. Just kind of curious about you guys' opinions.
Who wants to field that? You're asking a US policy question to a non-US policy specialist panel, so you're kind of asking for it. John, do you feel confident answering that?
Not
one?
exactly clear what the questioner wants us to answer, what exactly the question is. Could you just repeat it, please?
It's what are the prospects of the CHIPS Act?
Yeah, kind of the from focusing on the tech and industry side of things, the views of the kind of implications of the CHIPS Act, especially for the semiconductor industry moving forward. Because I know there's a lot of funding allocated, all that kind of, there's a lot of infrastructure support. So just how do you think that'll impact the industry and kind of our tech development moving forward?
In the United States?
Yes, or generally anywhere, but yes.
I would just say that, I mean, the assumption is that obviously it will stimulate it, but also it will remove one of its key markets, which is a serious problem, and new markets will have to be found. The other point that I just wanted to mention is that a lot of stress was made by one of the speakers on the fact that China is being excluded from the very most advanced levels of chip. I mean, very 2 nanometers, 3 nanometer chip manufacturing. I think we should be careful not to assume that there's a huge penalty to be paid by not having access to those chips. There's obviously a penalty to be paid, but I'm not exactly sure that we know yet what kind of penalty China will pay by not having access to those kinds of chips. Obviously, it can still do a lot of things that it's been doing with what I call commodity chips, or chips at the, say, 12 nanometer level or 10 nanometer level. But what will actually the impact be of not having 2 or 3 nanometer chips until we've actually built things using them? Obviously, certain things will happen more slowly. Obviously, certain things will happen less efficiently. But how much damage it will actually cause to China's capacity or willingness to play a dominant role in world markets and also have a powerful military machine, I don't think we know yet. So I don't think we should assume that this is necessarily going to be a huge burden for China. It obviously will be a burden, but I think it's hard to anticipate how seriously it will affect China's capacity to be a global market leader in a whole lot of areas that don't require chips as powerful, as efficient as, say, a 2 nanometer or a 3 nanometer or a stacked chip.
So let me just add, I agree with the professor that in many ways the CHIPS Act, which funds basically $52 billion for R&D to build new manufacturing plants, it does help stimulate producing manufacturing here, but comparatively, it's not as much as you need in order to create a broad base, right? So for instance, last month, South Korea announced that it was investing $261 billion in a chip cluster south of Seoul. Also look at TSMC, they've announced they're going to invest $100 billion a couple of years ago over the next 3 years. But what I think is probably perhaps in some ways comparably powerful is this has animated a lot of discussion and coordination through the U.S. to its alliances partners, right? There's vigorous debate right now. There's also vigorous ongoing discussion about how exactly these funds are distributed, also how the commerce restrictions that are tied to these funds are going to be regulated. So in many ways, it's maybe not brought manufacturing home, but it's at least brought the discussion home to the U.S.
I mean, I think that last point I think is important, but it also had that you know, it's expecting a lot out of a few tens of billions of dollars. I mean, that is pointed out as chump change, and some of it goes to things like getting TSMC to set up a business unsensible plant. I mean, this is about securing supply chains. It's partly a jobs program. It can have these other effects too, but you know, that's got to be weighted against the disruptions of what had been a deeply integrated economic order. There are going to be costs to doing that. On the very high end stuff, I'd agree. We don't know what it means, and a lot of military hardware doesn't depend on the super high end stuff. I mean, you know, Russia's now pulling things out of washing machines, apparently, right? And my washing machine, I can tell you, is not high tech. But the other thing is, but there is a pride element in China. I mean, they have identified we're going to not only be self-sufficient but dominate the world. And by the way, there's a tension between those two things, right? To be technologically self-sufficient and to dominate the globe in industries is a schizophrenic strategy. But China wants to be, you know, at the leading edge in key high-tech industries, not being able to have access to some of the high-end chips, you know, for AI purposes and things like that. It is if not hugely economically impactful in the short term, is part of the sort of national economic strategy pride element, at least, that they've tied their wagon to.
Thank you. Quick question. So I'm a Taiwanese American, and you know, in the last few years, I've seen a lot of things that's happening that you know, obviously as a Taiwanese and as American, you see things happening that are somewhat conflicting, right? So a lot of times it's like, which side am I standing on? And but you know, lately it's been great to see that my Taiwanese side has been great to see that the tremendous support that Taiwan is getting from the U.S. in terms of, you know, standing, you know, from a military perspective, from various aspects. But at the same time, as an American, you know, I also understand and support our need to be self-serving, right, for our own interests. And that's why, you know, we now in the current time we see a lot of you know, as China is doing this various things, you know, the U.S. is saying, look, you know, short of coming out and saying it, that hey, from a military perspective, we're here to take care of Taiwan. You know, we're going to make sure it's okay, because obviously, you know, for our own purposes, right? And we talk about the 50, 60 machines, EVU machines that's sitting in Taiwan. We don't want that to fall into China's hands. Now, while we're doing that, it also bothers me a little bit that you know, at the same time we are, you know, with TSMC, you know, companies like that we are also putting a lot of pressure or, you know, semantics, right? Whether it's pressure or incentives to have them bring production to the U.S., right? Which makes Taiwan less relevant. So we have a lot of experts here. I'm just curious what your view is on this, and how do you think this will play out in the end? Actually, I have a second part, if that's, I'm getting a little greedy.
I think it was kind of asked and answered, right? Everyone's sort of saying that, I mean, if the TSMC, that shifting production to the US is challenging, right? Even for TSMC, therefore, it's unlikely to reduce Taiwan's relevance to the United States in the short run.
Yes, I'm Clayton Sparrow, Georgia Tech alum. Many historians look to one of the motivations for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor to be restrictions put on the access by Japan to oil, which of course it needs to import in order to survive. I'm wondering if the importance of the latest technology being restricted to China, about which the importance, of course, is in doubt, but if it gets to be huge, then it would seem to me that fear, honor, and interest would motivate PRC to invade and take over Taiwan, if for no other reason than to prevent the rest of the world from having easy access to this technology. I wonder if that's a logical thought process. Thank you.
That is a great question, in my opinion. And I actually discussed a little in my forthcoming book whether the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese was a consequence of the American sanctions, sort of try to limit the Japanese activities on the Asian continent, or something that could be done differently. My short answer to that is, it's probably not the problem of the sanctions that caused the Japanese to go desperate to bomb Pearl Harbor. Rather, it's the timing of the sanctions. Let's just imagine if the sanctions were applied earlier in 1931, not in 1941. Right, things would be very different. If the sanctions were really in place in 1931, when the Japanese invaded Manchuria in China and created Manchukuo, and in 1937, when Japanese invaded China full scale, that would have a different kind of impact, actually increase the chance of peace. It is the timing, it's not the action that really probably should be really double checked again. Thank you.
Alistair. I have something to say on that. Well.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you go, then I'll come. It's fine.
I just wanted to say something on, there is a huge amount of uncertainty about what the future of warfare is going to be. But I think the PRC's model is one of leapfrog development, and we've seen this before. So China's current stage of military modernization really began with something called Project 995 in 1999. And there was probably 3 5-year plans attached to this, a 15-year modernization strategy. And this strategy resulted in things like anti-ship ballistic missiles and hypersonic missiles, which actually did leapfrog American military advantage in some significant ways and the current levels of technology. And my view is, even if we don't know what warfare is going to look like in 2035, and maybe the PLA doesn't know either, but probably it's going to involve autonomous systems powered by artificial intelligences, which rely on very powerful chips acting in maybe an autonomous manner. And if you're going to build that sort of military to leapfrog the current era of technological development, you need leading node chips, not lagging edge chips, if you're going to be competitive, comparatively speaking. And that's why I think the whole PLA strategy of intelligentization today actually relies on reliable access to the leading nodes. And that's why the export controls, I think, are a direct response to that strategy.
Could I add a point there? It's hard for me to come in from a way out here. Is it from?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Me, okay, I'm John. Just say John, I know you.
John, right.
Yeah, your point is important. The point just made is important because I've asked people here who are experts in this domain whether Biden's attempt to deny China access to high-end chips as those made by TSMC would be a reason for China to invade Taiwan, an added reason for China to invade Taiwan. And most of the experts I've spoken to have said they don't think so. But I think that the point that has just been made suggests that it may be an added incentive for them to do it. And that's really bothers me quite a lot. And in fact, what General Breedlove said earlier is also important in this respect, because he stressed again and again that America has already telegraphed out the statement he said, and I'm sure he's right, that they will not invade China in some sort of land invasion. The point then for the Taiwanese is, can we rely on America to defend us really? And bringing TSMC back to American soil is another reason for TSMC to wonder, well, what is America's game here exactly? Why are they bringing this company back to American soil? One reason for that would be a reason they would no longer need to defend Taiwan if one of the real things they wanted to protect was not just simply democracy, but that semiconductor industry. So I think possibly the Taiwanese are unsettled by this move by President Biden, that it's more in America's interest than in Taiwan's interest, as was said by the keynote speaker. And I'm quite worried that it might be an added incentive for Taiwan to invade, for China to invade Taiwan, although most people don't think I'm right about that.
2 quick things if I can. That one is the the 995 project was a direct response to China's perceived weakness in the third cross-straits crisis. So it was a sense that the US had demonstrated military superiority in the region and China needed to modernize to counter that. And there's a little bit of that dynamic going on here. The other thing I'd say, though, is in terms of the oil issue, one shouldn't lean too heavily on the notion that China's going to do a rational economic cost benefit analysis on this. Well, two steps. One is the economic cost benefit analysis. You may gain something, but you blow up a system in which China has benefited hugely from global economic integration. I think China realizes that any moves in this area are going to be hugely, hugely economically costly. So any decision to invade Taiwan is not likely to be driven by a sense that it's a good idea, cost benefit wise, even if we make the costs very painful. It's going to be something more of either a miscalculation about how easy it will be and how low the consequences will be. Does the West have a stomach to do this, either the war or the protracted sanctions that would follow? Or Xi Jinping will reach the conclusion, and who knows what he hears from whom these days, that Taiwan has irredeemably drifted away. And that it's no longer a question of when do we win the Taiwan issue, but are we losing it now? And if that happens, then I think you're in a very different realm, and you should go read your Thucydides, only the first two parts.
Not so long ago, Warren Buffett made a huge investment in TSMC. And then within about a year, he divested almost all of that. This is the most successful long-term value investor in the history of the world. Why would he make, in the view of the panel, why would he make such a rapid change in his view of TSMC?
I think if we knew that answer, we wouldn't be here because we'd be really, really rich. Does anybody have a better answer to him?
We have a guest panelist.
Yeah, so actually, Buffett just answered the question by himself. He said that it's the geopolitical tension that the company had no control. So he still say TSMC is a great company, but just there are other great companies without geopolitical tension. So he finds there are other target for him to invest. That's his answer to a Japanese newspaper.
Charles Yu, born in Taiwan some time ago, or more accurately, should I say, it's many, many plus years ago. So I would like to ask this panel, if you can make a bold prediction in your opinion in reference to this. So China and Taiwan, I, as a person, and we have many friends, business colleagues, and relatives in both China and Taiwan, and our blood runs the same redness. So I love both China and Taiwan. So let's say all the diplomatic and diplomacy didn't work, no good. Okay, so militarily, okay, the bullets start to fly more accurately. Missiles are launched. So the war is turning hot. So I would like this panel, your prediction, who will win the war? China, Taiwan, or maybe the US? Currently, I had a couple $100 in the US bank. Based on your results, okay, I will make a better decision whether I will send keep my money where it's at right now or ship it to China or Taiwan. Thank you.
This is a great question. That makes me feel my line of a boring job is not totally boring, and actually has some real world implication. I think I guess all of us here, I shouldn't say all of us, many of us here do share your sensitivity, your feelings about Chinese people, Taiwanese people, and American people as well. And so that's why I sort of wished the Cold War will stay cold. Well, let's never go to hot war. But in the overall scheme of things, human beings have gone through many, many wars, right? Sometimes brutal, sometimes less so, for other values. So I would not rule war completely out and hard war completely out. Well, if you ask me which side should win or should win, I can tell you very clearly which side I hope to win. But which side will end up winning is up in the air. Because in history, as you all know, human history is littered with cases where the undesirables, the backward, the kind of inferior ones actually eventually win. Good guys win only exist in Hollywood movies, right? Later on automatically. So good guys don't always win. So that really kind of prompted me to think about what we are doing here is actually of meaning, of value. That is, we try to make sure that good guys win or the war stay cold. But if the bad guys wins, so be it. That's human history.
I think Chinese people in Taiwan, the Taiwanese people who have a wish to maintain links with China would have an opportunity to express themselves in next year's election in Taiwan. And that might be an extremely important point, in an inflection point in the relationships between the United States, China, and Taiwan, particularly if those people who support increased links with China come out in force and actually might win the election. I don't know what their chances are. I don't follow Taiwanese politics closely enough. So maybe we shouldn't assume that a war is inevitable. Maybe there are other ways in which the population in Taiwan can express its desires and forestall war by those who want closer links with China having some sort of say in how the future of these three countries develops.
So I think quite a lot of the questions and the discussion has been about an invasion, but as people in the panel have said, it is probably not going to happen as a result of like President Biden trying to like put restrictions on China. I'm more interested in what someone brought up about like a blockade or like an economic blockade around the country, since it is a pretty small island in close proximity to the mainland of China, and how that would have a severe impact on the costs of many of the high-tech semiconductors that come out of the country. What do you think is the possibility of some kind of like an economic or naval blockade? And given that the US history in the South China Seas, and I'm thinking particularly to the Scarborough Shoal and the Philippines, where the US has not had the best history in contesting China in these kinds of like island takeovers or island dukes in this area. How do you think they're doing enough now, or should they be doing more to try and prevent something like this from happening?
So the thinking about what form of action China would take in a Taiwan crisis has been shifting some. For a long time, the thought was it was going to be gray zone, sort of military activities that don't cross the threshold, possibility of an economic blockade or a physical blockade, and that's still in the mix. I worry it's actually been getting less attention now, because I think it still is fairly likely, because it complicates the U.S. response. Much easier for the U.S. to respond if there's a kinetic invasion, even more so if China goes big and goes early against U.S. bases in Japan or Guam. Then we're all in. But would the U.S. fully react in the event of an economic blockade or physical blockade? Tougher calculation, and that's long been the Chinese thinking. A lot of U.S. discourse on that now thinks that the possibility of a full-on attack is more likely. I'm not sure that's right, but that's where thinking is. Two things about that, though. One is that the practice drills that China has been through after Pelosi and on a more modest scale after McCarthy have been more blockade rather than invasion prep. But it'd be harder to do invasion prep blockade, obviously, practice. But that seems to be the skills that are being perfected. And the other thing is PLA doctrine on a blockade is a lot more destructive than U.S. definitions of blockade tend to be. At least the people who study the PLA much closer than I do say that a blockade would actually include a fair amount of physical destruction, quite possibly, at least that's in the repertoire. So it becomes messier still. On the failure to deter, I mean, that's one of the issues, right? and you hear that a lot, and the first panel is way more expert on this than I and probably others up here are, but did the US fail to deter Russia by not doing more about Crimea and the earlier encroachments in the Donbass? Well, you know, it's a question of signaling, and we didn't do it in the South China Sea. I think there are ways of explaining why that's much less of a threat to American interests, and there are ways of trying to draw distinctions, and Biden has been doing that by suggesting the differences between Ukraine and Taiwan. Actually, one of the few things the US and China agree about is Taiwan and Ukraine are completely different. The problem is that's a bad message because the US says we'll actually go to war over Taiwan as we wouldn't directly over Ukraine. And China says, you know, there's no question of an international conflict here. It's purely domestic. So they actually wind up in opposite places. But it's a fair question. And I think the blockade or economic isolation are very much possibilities in the toolkit that we need to worry about, largely because, you know, Biden's guarantees don't speak to that. Even if you take them seriously, they don't speak to the lesser forms of coercion. He condemns them, and there's certainly lots of condemnation of Chinese coercion of Taiwan, but the commitment, the sort of erosion of ambiguity for clarity has been limited to kinetic attack scenarios.
Right, so we've now come to the end of regulation. But as I said, if people want to stay and carry on the conversation, we can do so for a bit longer. So I'm going to give you a moment. Wow. Voting with their butts. All right, right. Rather opposite of voting with your feet. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know there are loads of them. There are loads of them. Being overridden by my boss.
Hi, how are you? I had one question. It was brought to my attention about an article that was written by the Wall Street Journal, and it was called "For Taiwan, as far as Ukraine, Energy Security is Existential" by Nathaniel Raplin. We've been talking a lot about Taiwan being a powerhouse for chip production. So my question is, how can Taiwan make use of its role as a powerhouse in chip production to significantly improve its ability to be more energy independent and also to develop other systems of energy sufficiency, which would really, really improve Taiwan in this regard? Thank you.
Very quickly, Taiwan has been doing really actually well in terms of energy efficiency. International comparisons seems to suggest that Taiwan is ranked very high in terms of how efficient they use energy, especially like a carbon emission energy. So Taiwan is already kind of a world leader in that regard, better than the United States, much better than the PRC. Thank you.
So, but obviously lots of the manufacturing is highly energy intensive, and that's a concern. And Taiwan, you know, obviously depends on imports of fossil fuels. It has essentially none. Nuclear power plants have become politically quite dicey and toxic in Taiwan, so there are vulnerabilities there. Taiwan's doing a lot of alternative energy, but I think it's I think it's still a good ways away from self-sufficiency.
Okay, I've been overruled again, and I've been told now we are out of time. So let me please join me in thanking our panel. And now over to Dalton to close us out.
Thank you. So this concludes you know, our symposium, and I hope you get enough food for thought and food for fat. I hope you find today's discussion interesting and insightful. And if you enjoy today's discussion, please follow the Sam Nunn School's social media or subscribe to our mailing list because we regularly host important discussions of contemporary international issues. So I do hope to see you again in our future events. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation.